All right, I'm Roger McCarty. This is 2016 in November. I was born in 1953, so I'm now 63 years old. And I'm going to tell a little bit about my life for my family and friends. My mom always told the story of how the doctor, when I was being delivered, they said the cord was wrapped around my neck 3 times, and he said it should have killed me. And my mom always said that she had a real strong impression at that time that the Lord was watching over me and that He'd have an influence in my life, and He certainly has. I grew up in Coos Bay, Oregon. My parents' home overlooked the ocean, and we spent a lot of time on the beach and down fishing in the bay and digging clams and doing a lot of interesting things there. The world's second largest sand dunes begins there at Coos Bay and goes 50 miles north. And we spent a lot of time out in the sand dunes with sand buggies and doing sand surfing and up in the lakes there. The largest recreational lake in Oregon is about 10 miles away, and we had a scout cabin up there, and we'd go skiing and water skiing and things. And later, my family purchased a cabin, and so they had a chance to do a lot of things there associated with that. My dad owned a Western auto store, and over the years he added to those auto parts with bikes and tires and lawnmowers and televisions and appliances and furniture, and just had kind of a little general store. We actually lived in a little town called Empire that had about 2,000 to 4,000 people in it, and it was kind of the general store in town. And I started working there when I was 8 years old. I would come down every day after school and all day Saturday, and during the summers I'd work 6 days a week. I did take some time out here and there to go do something with a friend or whatever, but generally I worked during that time for between the time I was 8 and 18. I never resented it. I always felt like I was doing my part to help the family. And so that was always an interesting thing for me as I thought about that. My dad could never pay me. The store during the time that I was a teenager just wasn't making enough money. And I remember I kept the books, and I can remember my mom coming down, and I needed to write a check for $45. She would get $45 each week to feed a 10-person family. And because we had there were 7 children, my parents, and then my grandfather lived with us. And there were times that it was really hard to find $45 for enough food for the week. There were times I remember that we could buy clothing once a year when school started, and I could have 3 shirts and 3 pants. And that was what we could afford. So I grew up in this time frame where security was very important to me. I worried a lot about finances, and my dad was always one who loved to do things for the family, and we traveled a lot, but we always traveled and camped. We never stayed in hotels or anything like that. We'd camp and go to lakes and campgrounds and things. But I can remember, my mom reminds me that when we would go like to a Dairy Queen, they'd stop, and everybody would order something. I wouldn't order anything. And she'd say, well, let's get you something. And I said, no, we can't afford it. And I wouldn't have anything because I didn't think that we should be spending the money on that. And I didn't think we had it. So it was really kind of interesting. From a very young age, I was quite conservative fiscally because of those feelings and things. When I was 16, my dad came home one day and he said, you start work on Monday. It was right at the beginning of summer. He said, you start work at Monday down at the Astoria Fish Factory. And I thought, okay. Now, by the way, he didn't ask me, and we hadn't talked about this in any way, but he had run into a guy, and the guy had told him he was going to be hiring somebody. My dad was on city council and was in Lyons and was in Kiwanis and was in the Salvation Army on the board of directors, and he was a volunteer fireman and a volunteer deputy sheriff. And when you're in a small town, you do a lot of things. So my dad knew everybody. And because of that, he heard that this guy was going to hire somebody to work at this factory for the summer, or a fishery. It's a place that where the boats bring in fish to be prepared and then sent out for food. So he said, you start Monday, 6 a.m. So I thought, great. I never thought to ask him, well, did we talk about this? And, but I was going to get paid money for actually working. And so that seemed like a good deal to me. So I drove down there. I remember the fog was so thick. Now we're on the coast of Oregon, that fog rolls in. And I had to drive about 8 miles to get down to this little fishery. And my dad had loaned me a 56 Chevy. Jacked up in the back, wide dish ovals, and it was an interesting car for a 16-year-old in 1969, and it's a 56 Chevy. But anyway, I remember driving down, and the fog was so thick I could not see the white line by looking over my hood. I couldn't see the white line on the street, so I had to open my door and look at the white line on the street out with my door open, and I drove that 8 miles down that curvy coast road to get to that fish factory at 8 o'clock or at 6 o'clock, looking at the little line on the road. And I got down there, and what they had me do for the first day was scrub shrimp boxes. So these boxes have been on a shrimp boat for a couple weeks, and now they've dumped the shrimp into the boiler, and somebody needed to clean out with brushes and soap the inside of these big wooden boxes, which I'd have to get halfway in it to get to the bottom. Pretty lousy job. I was really happy that was the only day they had shrimp. That was the last day of shrimp. After that, I got to shovel fish guts. That was really fun. So they'd bring in these big ocean fish, and they'd cut them open, and they'd fillet them, and then they'd take the carcasses and drop them down onto a conveyor belt that brought them down to me. And there was a board across the conveyor belt, and it would drop the fish down on the concrete. And I took this pole, which had a little bent nail at the end, and I would jab the carcass, and I'd lift it up shoulder height and put it into a hopper. And the hopper would then grind up the food, or the fish, and they would make mink food out of it. There were a lot of mink ranches in the area, and they would make mink food out of this fish. And so my job, there were 60 women filleting fish, and they could fillet about 1 fish a minute, which means I had 1 fish a second that were fish like this, the ocean fish. They would come down 1 a second, and I would stab them, lift, stab, lift. That was my 8-hour job. Now, what would happen is sometimes the hopper would fill up, and they couldn't do any more. I couldn't put more fish up there because the hopper was full. And so I had to keep the fish off of the conveyor belt, and it would build up till it was all, like waist high. And then somebody would come and empty the hopper, and then I would have to shovel the fish as quickly as I could to get caught back up so I could go back to using the pole. On a good day, I would finish that in 4 or 5 hours, and they'd be out of fish. And so then I got to go work in the 20-degree below zero freezers, moving boxes around. On a really good day, I got to go up in the attic and make cardboard boxes on a staple gun machine up there. And that was better than working in the 20-degree below zero freezers. At the end of the summer, I told the people who worked there, I said, listen, you don't need me. I said, all you need is where that little conveyor belt comes in, all you need is to have that drop off into a little hopper and have a little conveyor belt that ran up and dumped in to the hopper to grind the food. I said, you don't need to pay me $2 an hour to do this, which was an exorbitant amount of money in those times because minimum wage was only $1.60. So I really felt great making $2 an hour. But I said, you don't need me, and I am never coming back to do this job. And so they did. They put the little conveyor belt in, and it solved their problem. I went home after that last day, and by the way, my mom would never let me come in the house. I had to actually get undressed on the porch because she would not allow that clothing that smelled like fish to come into the house. So I remember my dad came home that last day, and I said, Dad, thanks for getting me the job. I put a lot of money in the bank, And that was great. I really appreciate it. But I want you to know, I am never going to do another job like that. I'm going to go to college, and I'm going to get an education, and I'm going to get a good job, and I'm never doing another job like that. My dad looked up to me. He was always a man of few words. He looked up to me and said, well, why did you think I got you the job anyway? Okay, well, you're a smart man, Dad. So that was kind of really my first job where I wasn't working for my dad. Now, I just want to mention that as a child, I was really quite driven. It's kind of funny. I enjoyed being around people. I had sociality, particularly with the kids at church, and we'd do sleepovers and things. But in general, I wasn't one to go hang out with people. I did a lot of reading. I would watch documentaries and things. I loved to learn stuff, and I had a great memory, and I could remember basically anything I saw. I have a very visual memory. And I just loved to learn. I loved to do things. As an example, in the 4th grade, they had a chart for reading books, and these had to be chapter books, so 100 to 200 page kind of books. And the goal was kind of to read maybe 10 books during the year. Well, I read 76. And so they had to kind of give a new chart up there to put all the stars on it because I like to read. I like to do that kind of stuff. We had a trampoline in our backyard, and I jumped a lot on the trampoline, and friends would come over and join me. But I really didn't seek out the opportunity to go be around other people that much because I always had enough stuff that I was doing that I was happy and learning and growing. But I was very driven. So as an example of this drive, in junior high, they had points that they gave for participation in choir, in band, in each of the sports you played, in being in the school play and participating on the school paper, and all of the different things that you could do. And they gave you points. And at the end of the year, they would have a Hall of Fame, and the people with the most points name would go on the Hall of Fame plaque. Well, I did all those things, and I did lots more. And I went in every morning and set up the chair, or took the chairs off the tables in the cafeteria and set the cafeteria up with the janitor. And I got points for doing that. I did everything. And at the end of the year, I had the most points that any junior high student had ever gotten in the history of the school. And I remember going back there years later, and they still had the Hall of Fame plaques up, and I went down the hall, and yep, I still had the record for the most points anybody had ever gotten. So I was just really kind of driven on the things that I did there. I was the youngest Eagle in the history of Oregon. I had a contest with one of my friends, and when we entered 11-year-old Scouts, I did every one of the positions, from tenderfoot to second class to first class. There's a minimum amount of time you have to be each one of those. Well, I did the absolute minimums right up to Eagle. And so I actually turned in my papers to be an Eagle at 12 years old. And I won. I beat my friend, who was actually 3 or 4 months older than me. But I just, I was kind of driven. I became, the council asked me to run for, report to the governor as the outstanding scout of the year, and I won for the council, and then I reported to the governor for the state as the outstanding scout. After that, I was asked to speak at a number of the clubs, the Lions Club and Optimists and Kiwanis and these. And so I did a lot of studying with Norman Vincent Peale, with Napoleon Hill, with a lot of these success-oriented people. And so I gave speeches to a lot of the clubs and things about having a passion and being a success. And so I gave these speeches all over town and was asked to come back and do even follow-ups. So, driven. I guess I should have mentioned when I was in the 3rd or 4th grade, our elementary school had a carnival, and you could sell tickets for the carnival. I went out every day after school selling tickets as a 3rd or 4th grader, and I became the king of the carnival it went up to 6th grade, and I was like 3rd or 4th, but I was still the king of the carnival. And they showed me next to this girl. They have a picture of this girl's way taller than me because she's a 6th grader, and I'm like a 3rd grader. But I was the king of the carnival because I sold more tickets than anybody because, again, I was very passionate. I continued on in high school to continue to be involved in a lot of things. I was the class vice president. I was student body vice president. I, for 4 years, was the football announcer. We would have 8,000 people come to football games. And I sat up in the loge box or up in the news, where the radio and the newscast, the newspaper people sat. And I would announce the game from over the PA system for 4 years. I did that. I was in music groups. I was in the mixed chorus and then in the concert choirs. I was in madrigals. I was in Beachcombers, which was the school quartet. I was in Gleeman's, which is the school octet. I did, my senior year, I was the student director of the mixed chorus. So I took lots of music classes. I was in lots of plays. I was in Little Abner. I was in Once Upon a Mattress. I was Felix in The Odd Couple. Did a number of other plays. But at the same time, I did all honor classes in chemistry and physics and honors English and all these different things because I was just always interested in doing stuff. Nobody else in my family was really a student. And so I remember it in 5th grade, my grades were about average. I was C's and B's, maybe an A every once in a while. And I decided in the 5th grade that if I was going to make something of myself, I had to do better. And I actually kept track of all of my GPAs by report card from the time I was in 5th grade till I was a senior in high school. And I actually had perfect progression. Every semester, my GPA got higher from starting at it was around a 3. Yeah, maybe even a little under a 3. And I had perfect progression until my the first year of my, first or second semester of my junior year, I got a 4.0. First time I'd ever had a 4.0 in my life. And then I finished school with 4.0s. So I made decisions and I followed through. That was kind of who I was. And one of the things my parents always told me was that whenever I would question whether I could do something, they said, well, you're a McCarty. You can do whatever you want. You can do whatever you need to. And I remember that always just stuck. And I read something once that said, 2 men can do anything as long as one of them's God. And so I always tried to work with God and pray and work hard to do what I could do. And I was normally able to accomplish what I really wanted. I went to Boise State. I was Attorney General at Boise State. I went to the state solo contest and was a finalist for the state. And so I had a chance to do lots of things. And I enjoyed all those very eclectic list of things that I was involved in. And as I was preparing to graduate high school, there was a dock strike. Now, Coos Bay was the world's largest lumber shipping port. So we had about, a third of the people in the city worked out in the forests, cutting down trees. Another third or more worked in the sawmills. There were 23 sawmills in town, and they worked in the sawmills. Or there were some that fished, and then there were other people who were storekeepers. And that was kind of who was there. Very blue-collar kind of town. But when the dock workers, longshoremen, when they struck, well, they couldn't ship anything. So all of the lumber started piling up. And then they started piling up in vacant lots all over town. And when they had no more place to put the lumber, they shut the sawmills down. And everybody was out of work. And then they shut down the forest because they didn't need any more trees. All of those people were out of the work. So we had like 75% of the people in the town were out of work. And now I'm graduating. And remember, I've been working for my dad all these years, so I don't have any money. Or I have very little money. I had about $300 in the bank that I'd saved up from the fishery and stuff. And I didn't know what to do. I went around to every place in town knocking on doors saying, would you hire me? And nobody would hire me. Every place I looked, all over town. And I knocked on a lot of doors. Finally, my dad came home from a Lions meeting and said, I've heard this guy at Conrad's is going to hire one summer help. He normally hired 3 or 4, but this summer he's going to hire one person to back up his 23 salesmen as they went on vacations. A person was supposed to be there to help out. So I said, I went down that Monday morning after my dad heard about this on Friday afternoon. So I went down Monday morning after seminary. So I went to seminary at 6 o'clock in the morning. And then at 7 o'clock on my way going to high school, I stopped at the lumberyard and stood on the doorstep waiting until he came in. And when he got there, he was the first one there. And it was a very large lumberyard. Probably 100 people worked at it. It was a very large, a Home Depot on steroids. And when he came in, I said, I've heard that you're looking for somebody. I really want to work. I need the money. And, would you consider taking me on as your summer help? He said, well, another lumberyard's closing down in the next town over. And he says, I'm probably going to take some of those people. Those men will be out of work. They have families. And I said, listen, I'm going to have a family someday too. And I really need the work. And, I will be here. You will never regret hiring me. I will do a great job for you. And he said, well, let me think about it. Leave me your name and number and I'll give you a call. Well, the next morning at 7 a.m., Tuesday morning, I was standing on his doorstep when he got there. And we had the exact same conversation. We went through the whole conversation again, and it ended the exact same way. Well, I'll call you. Wednesday morning, 7 a.m., I'm standing on his doorstep because this is the last week of school. I got to start work. We have the same conversation Wednesday, nothing varied. So and he sent me off. Thursday, 7 a.m., I'm on his doorstep, and we have the same conversation again. At the end, he sent me off. The next day was senior skip day because it was going to be graduation that night. So we didn't have seminary. So I remember coming in. I stopped the car partway into town. I remember praying and saying, I've always paid my tithing. I've always tried to live righteously, and I really need your help. And I remember having a good feeling. I drove on in, and when I got there, I was standing on the door. When he got there, he said, you really want this job, don't you? And I said, I really do. He said, well, when can you start? I said, it's senior skip day. I can start right now. And he said, well, come on in. So he comes in and he fills out the paper, and he takes one of his people and said, go show Roger around the lot, show him what things are and stuff. And I forgot to mention, I know nothing about carpentry and building and stuff. My hands are worthless blocks of wood. I mean, I'm just not good mechanically. And so somebody starts walking me around, and they take me outside, and they have these big, long rows of wood piled up in stacks. And he said, well, this row here's the 2x4s, and this one's the 2x6s. And I said, wait a minute. Which one of those boards are the 2x4s? He says, well, they're all 2x4s. And I said, well, how can they all be 2x4s? They're different lengths. That's what I knew about lumber. I know anything about building houses and stuff. But now I'm going to be helping people as they come in to do this. Within a month, I could spec out an entire house and write up an entire order for everything just from the blueprints. I could take a blueprint of a house. I could spec out the entire house in 1 month. I had to learn a lot of stuff. I made a lot of mistakes early. But every month after that first month, I was the top salesman. Remember, these are 25 other men who have been doing this for years and years and years and years. But every month I was the top salesman. I sold more than everybody else. And so the owner knew this because they reported every month who was the top salesman, and I was always the top. And so I remember somebody was leaving the store, and he came and asked him. He said, why did you ask? Because people would come in and ask for me. And he said, why did you ask for him? He said, when I go to Roger, I only make one trip. When I go to anybody else, I may have to come back 3 times to finish a project. But when I came here to buy paneling for my house, he said, Roger went out and picked out the paneling. I was ready to go. Roger said, wait a minute. Do you have colored nails? He said, why do I need colored nails? Well, they're in the grooves of the panel when you're going to pound that in. Do you want a shiny nail I said, no, you want a colored nail the same color as the grout. He goes, oh, yeah, okay, well, let's get some colored nails. And so we go get colored nails. And then I'm getting ready to leave, and he said, well, wait a minute. Do you have a hammer that's a rubber hammer? Why do I need a rubber hammer? I said, do you want to take and leave big dents in your paneling? Oh, no, I don't want to do that. Well, then we better get you a rubber hammer. So he goes and gets that. And he said, now do you have some adhesive? And I said, why do I need adhesive? I'm nailing this thing. He said, well, if you don't put adhesive, you'll get bowing between the rows that you put the nails in. He goes, oh, yeah, we better get some adhesive. So we go get some adhesive. And I said, now do you have a caulking gun? Why do I need a caulking gun? Well, this adhesive comes in a caulking tube. And if you don't have a caulking gun, you can't apply it. Yeah, let's get a caulking gun. He said, so now I'm leaving here. I have everything I need. Roger never lets me leave without everything I need to do my job. And that's really valuable to me. So I always ask for him. Well, that's the way I tried to do. I always looked at my time in sales and things as being a way of solving people's problems. So I always thought, what's the problem? What are they really here for? They're not here to buy something. They're here to change their home in some way. And I want to make sure when they walk out that they have everything they need to change their home in the way that they want to change it. So that was a great experience for me, and as I prepared to go off to college. I was very worried about what I was going to do. So when I had my patriarchal blessing, it told me that I prayed and fasted to know, what should I do? Should I be a lawyer? Should I be a Indian chief, astronaut? What should I be? And I prayed about it, and I felt, when I had the thing, that right after they named my lineage, the very first thing they said was that my life would be involved in science and education, and that I'd find much success in life in science and education. And I thought, well, I don't really think I want to be a teacher, because I want a large family, and I didn't think I could have a large family on a teacher's salary. So I said, so I'll do science. So I went through the catalog of all the different majors, and I'm looking through them, and I didn't want to do biology, I didn't want to do chemistry, I didn't want to do physics, none of these did I think I wanted to do any of them. And I finally found this one called chemical engineering. And I didn't really know what they did. I had no concept of it. There certainly weren't any within 100 miles of my home. But I looked at the list, and my senior year, I took college prep English instead of honors, thinking my grammar was terrible. When I took the ACT test, my English was by far the worst part. And I just didn't know grammar and stuff, because I'd always taken advanced classes where they skip that. They just go on into literature and things. So I took this college prep in hopes that it would prepare me. Well, it didn't. It was a joke. And the kids who were in the class had no interest in doing anything. And it was just a disaster. I had a terrible year in English, didn't enjoy it at all, because nobody really cared. And I thought, I don't want to be around people who don't care. And so when I looked at the requirements to do chemical engineering, you had to have done calculus and trig and physics and chemistry and biology and all these different things, and you had to have an A or a B average in all of them. And I thought, well, there's going to be no slugs in that major, and there weren't. And so I said, that's why I majored in it. And I prayed about it and felt good, and so I picked that as my major. I went to Brigham Young University, the only school that I considered going to. Now, my dad had a 9th grade education. My mom was the first person who ever graduated high school in her family. We were not academics. We were not scholars. We were poor people who were trying to create a new life. And so the concept of going to college was foreign. In my high school, only 10% of the kids went on to college. My wife's high school in Fort Worth, 85% of the kids went on to college. But only 10% of the kids in my high school went on to college. So people just were not targeted toward that stuff. They told me I had to take the ACT. I had no idea what the ACT was. I showed up one morning after I'd been at a football game up in Eugene, and we didn't get back till 2 a.m. And I showed up in the morning with my number 2 pencil, and had no idea what the test was going to be about. And that's what I knew. I also remember my dad liked to keep my mom is the effusive, everybody, make you feel good about everything. So I got my scores back on the ACT, and I had a 29. At the time, that was in the top 2% of the scores, which was amazing for somebody who had no idea what they were doing. And so I told my mom. My mom was effusive, and it's so wonderful, and we're so happy. And she says, go tell your dad. So I walked into my dad, and he was sitting in his chair reading his paper. And I said, Dad, I got my ACT scores back. And he puts his paper down. I said, I got a 29. I said, that puts me in the top 2% in the country. He looked at me and said, did anybody get in the top 1%? And I said, yeah. He goes, okay. And he put his paper back up. That was my dad's way of saying, you're not all that hot. Just put yourself in place. And I thought, yeah, Dad, you're right. I got a lot more to do. But that was my dad. He wasn't trying to be mean. He was trying to say, be humble. And I always appreciated that. And so I did go to, I turned my papers in for BYU, but I never heard anything. And I never heard anything. And I didn't apply anywhere else. I didn't want to go anywhere else. I actually received 2 scholarship offers from the University of Oregon and from Baylor because of my music background. They offered me full ride scholarships to go into the music program. But I couldn't think about, I would either have to perform if I did music, and you're going to do that on the weekends or evenings when I'd have a chance to be with my kids. Or I'm going to be a teacher, which I wouldn't make enough money, so I'd have to teach students and stuff in the evenings and weekends to earn enough money for my family. And I said, I want to be around my family in the evenings and weekends. And so I couldn't think of anything I could do with music that would do that. So I said, instead, I'm going to pay my own way and do something else. Even though I loved music, I thought it could be a hobby instead of a career. So, and it was. I did music all through my life, in lots of different ways. So I turned the papers in, nothing came. Finally, in February or March, I got a letter saying, you have a half tuition scholarship. But I hadn't been accepted yet. And I kept waiting. Finally, in May, I got a letter saying you've been accepted. And it said, now you need to apply for your housing, and you need to apply by, guess what? It was the next day. That was the deadline to get into housing. And it was the day after I got the thing saying, they had just made a mistake. They had just lost my deal or whatever. Anyway, so I got in, and thankfully, otherwise I would have been dead meat. And so I loved BYU. I enjoyed it. Found it to be, could you give me that? I found it to be fascinating, and I loved being around Mormon girls. Now, I grew up in a little district. When I was born, there were 35 people who lived on the coast of Oregon that were members of the church. 35, 150-mile stretch, 50 miles wide, 35 members. By the time I was a teenager, there were 5 girls in the district that were my age. That's it. So unless I wanted to marry one of those 5 girls, that was going to be my choices. So BYU created the opportunity for me to date Mormon girls, and I thought that was amazing. In high school, I didn't date very much, partly because it was the 60s. It was free sex and free drugs, and it was just not an environment that I wanted to be in. And I just figured, why would anybody want to date me anyway? Who wants to date an ugly kid with no personality? So I figured nobody would date me. Although I did take out a few girls, and they said yes. And so I remember my senior year walking into the study hall and seeing all these cute girls with all these ugly guys. And I thought, what in the heck? Why are these cute girls with all these ugly guys? I said, I'm as ugly as any of them. Why won't they be with me? And I thought, because I didn't put myself out there. And I said, if I put myself out there, they probably would. So I said, I can't do anything now. It's spring of my senior year. Everybody knows who I am for what I am. But when I go to college, nobody knows me. I can be anything I want to be. How do they know that I wasn't the big man on campus and popular with all the girls? So when I got to BYU, I said, I am going to take girls out. I'm not going to worry about anything. And in my first 2 weeks at BYU, I went on 17 dates. Now, I didn't have any money. So the first thing I did when I got on campus, I went up to the student government office and I got a card by joining the social office that got me into all social activities for free and a date. In those days, the football games and the plays and everything were free to students. So I went to all the athletic events, I went to the plays, I went to the concerts, I went to all the social dances. In those days, they held 3 dances a week at BYU. So I would go to all those. So I went on all these dates. I spent 50 cents was the total amount I spent on those 17 dates, because one of the girls, when we got back, asked me to buy her a Twinkie out of the vending machine, and I said, I'll buy the Twinkie if you buy milk. So we shared. That was my whole, but all these girls said yes. Now, what I didn't understand at the time was that the average girl at BYU only got asked on 1 date a year. 1 date a year. So the fact that I was asking put these girls in a situation where nobody else is getting asked, so I'm being asked. So they all just said yes, which I thought was great. I didn't read. My thought was, I'm going to keep asking until somebody says no. Well, nobody said no, partly because they were just nice girls, and partly because most guys aren't asking them out. So I thought, this is so cool. So, I went out with the homecoming queen. I went out with the Belle of the Y. I went out with a girl that was on the cover of 17 magazine. I went out with Miss Nevada. I went out with Miss Oregon. But I decided, after a semester, this is silly. This is silly that a lot of these were pretty shallow. I found that a girl who was pretty as she was growing up got by on her looks often, not always, but a lot, got by on her looks. She didn't develop character and spirit and as much as a girl who didn't have everything handed to her on a plate. And I realized that a girl that had to go and develop her own character and develop her own intellect and develop athletic and different kind of skills, and then blooms at 18 or 19 and becomes, a pretty young lady as she matures, she has everything. She's got all of the capabilities. She's developed all these wonderful characteristics, and on top of that, she's pretty. So I started looking for those girls. And that's, in the end, who I married. I married a Renaissance woman of tremendous capability, smarter than me and better than me in almost everything, and was a lovely, beautiful girl at the time. So those are, but that was kind of my dating, and then I switched and I didn't date anymore the way that I had that first semester, and I felt much better about that. I served a mission to Washington, D.C., where when I went there, it was called the Maryland-Delaware mission, and had parts of New Jersey and Pennsylvania and Washington, D.C. in it. Later, they changed the name to the Washington, D.C. mission. I was there during the last 2 years as they built the Washington, D.C. temple. I had a chance to teach a lot of people. I had wonderful experiences. Had a chance to baptize many, many people, and it was a great, wonderful experience. Had some wonderful companions. Had a chance to do a number of leadership roles, and that was a great experience to help and train others. At one point, we were doing family history weeks, where we would go into a town and get the mayor to name a family history or family week. And during that week, we would come in with family home evening manuals. We would offer them to everybody in the city. We'd have a number of concerts and firesides and things that people in the city could attend and learn about Mormons and families. I was asked to participate previous to that in a quartet, a mission-wide quartet that would go around and sing at some of these events and things. But after doing that for a few weeks, I told the mission president that I'd really rather teach. I'd really rather be involved in the work as a traditional missionary. I didn't really want to be in the quartet singing, because I'd prefer to do the missionary work. And so he put me back out in the field. But then just a short time after that, he called me as an assistant to be over each of these weeks. So I would go for a week at a time to all these different towns in Dover, Delaware, and in Ocean City, and in Winchester, Virginia, and in Buck Valley, Pennsylvania, and all these different towns I'd go to for a week. And I'd run all the missions. We'd bring in 10 missionaries or so, and we'd be contacting everybody and putting on all these deals. And so I was just kind of an assistant for, I guess we did that for 3 or 4 months. And then I went back into the, this particular mission president didn't really use zones. He didn't think he had enough good leaders. So he would have districts with 20 to 26 missionaries, which is really the size of a zone. And then he'd have 2 district leaders that would lead that district. So I went back out as my final assignment as a district leader over a zone in McLean, Virginia. When I got there, I had a lot of trouble, a lot of problems with my missionaries. And I finally talked to the mission president and said, "What's going on?" He said, "Well, this stake in McLean has wonderful stake missionaries. They do a fabulous job. So I've just taken all my worst missionaries and dumped them into that stake, because they were just clogging up everywhere. If I put a bad missionary with a good missionary, I just slow down the good missionary. So I've taken all my bad missionaries and put them into one stake, a stake that can handle it on their own. And so you're the district leader over all the outcasts and the throwaways in the mission." I said, "Thanks." "Really appreciate that." He says, "Well, I thought you could do something with them." I said, "Well, we're going to." So my companion, and I had like one guy, he would not get up in the morning. His companion couldn't do anything. So we took a split, took him to be my companion, and my companion with him. I got him up, tried to get him up in the morning. He played bugle. He brought his bugle with him, so I blew the bugle in his ear and couldn't. Finally got a bucket of water and poured it on him. And I said, "You're getting up and we're tracting." Anyway, so we worked with all these guys. We set goals. And within a month, we were the #1 district in the mission. We were teaching the most, and after the second month, we were baptizing the most of anybody in the mission. And we got these guys going. So I like challenges. I like doing those kind of things. I found that great. A day before I went home, I had my bags packed, ready to go. I got a call from the mission president saying the temple is going to be dedicated in a couple of months, and we're going to have a viewing for people can come and walk through the temple. And we're going to have invitations. And I brought in a group of missionaries who are going to do that, but I want you to stay another few months. We don't know how long. I want you to stay and be in charge of the temple viewing of all these people and all the people who will come through the Washington, D.C. temple. And I said, I want to call you as an assistant again to come live in the mission home and be in charge of this. He says, but that'll mean you need to extend your mission. And so I said, well, okay. I said, he said, but you got to talk to your parents about what, in those days you didn't call home. You didn't call home at Christmas, you didn't call home at Mother's Day, you never call home. He said, but we don't have time to contact them any other way because you're coming home right away. We already bought your ticket, they know you're coming. So he said, so we're going to have you call them. I want you to call them tonight and make a decision. And he said, then I want you to tell me. And I said, okay. He says, take all the time you need to think about this. And this, by the way, this is about 6 o'clock at night. We're home for dinner. And I say, so I said, well, I'll call you in the morning. He says, no. I want you here 7 a.m. in the morning. Call me tonight. I have all the time I need, right? So we go out to teach a lesson, and I'm a little distracted, I have to admit, as I'm thinking about this. So we get back, and I call my parents. And I tell them what the mission president said. And he said, my parents said, my dad really said, did the mission president ask you to stay? And I said, yeah. He said, then why are you calling me? He's your priesthood leader. If he asked you to stay, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to stay. He said, that's right. He said, we don't really need to talk about this anymore, do we? Nope. But that's my dad, you know. If the Lord asked him to do something, it doesn't matter what it is, he would do it. And so I stayed. Had a wonderful experience. One of the things I got to do as we oversaw the missionaries who were at the temple during the viewing, but they would gather referrals. People would write referrals. And then I gathered all the referrals. I would make copies of them. We kept a copy, and we'd send a copy out to the missionaries who were the ones responsible for that referral. Now, these people were coming from all over the world, so I had to create packets out to all parts of the world, and then to every one of our zones, and determine where this person lived and which zone they were in, and or which district or what actual area they were in. I'd send them out. But I also read them all, because the mission president said, I don't want, some of these getting lost. So I read every one of these 50,000 referrals over about a 6-week period. And I would determine which ones were high priority and which ones could be followed up on later. And I had a great experience. Now, the Washington, D.C. temple has an assembly hall at the top on the 7th floor. And that's where they were going to hold the dedication. The Mormon Tabernacle Choir came into town, sang at the Kennedy Center. President Kimball was there. I had a chance to go to that concert and met President Kimball afterwards. And they were there getting ready for the dedication. I had front row center tickets right in front of the rostrum where President Kimball would dedicate the temple. And the mission president comes into my room 2 days before the dedication and said, you got to go home tomorrow morning. And I said, wait, I have tickets to the dedication. I want to go to the dedication. He said, no, you have to go home tomorrow morning. I said, can't you ask to get it extended? He said, I've already extended you 5 times. I said, I didn't know that. He says, yeah, I never told you. He said, and Eldon, he grew up with Eldon Tanner. He says, Eldon says, you got to go home tomorrow. You cannot stay any longer. You've already stayed out 2 or 3 months. I can't remember the exact amount of time, but like 3 months longer than you're supposed to be here. You have to go home. So I said, okay, so I went home. Didn't have any choice. When I got home, I went to visit my brother, who was at work. He was at a marina, a large marina that sold boats. And I went to see him at the marina and said hi. And he introduced me around and took me into his boss and said, my brother just came back from Washington, D.C. He was a missionary there. And he asked me, so what did you do? Well, I told him. I was pretty excited about it. You can probably even tell now, as a 63-year-old man, my eyes light up and I get pretty excited. Well, trust me, at 21 years old, those eyes were like fire. And I got real excited, and I told him about what I had done. Well, that night, my brother comes home and said he wants you to come back and talk to him again. So I thought, well, maybe he wants to learn about the church. So, I go back in the next day, and he offers me a job. Said, I saw how you told me about your mission. He said, if you can tell people about boats the way you told me about your mission, you can sell boats. And he said, I'll pay you $1,000 a month. In those days, college students working full-time, 40 hours a week, could make about $300 a month. I'll pay you a base salary of $1,000 a month and commissions and anything you make over that. And so, that was a huge offer. And I said, well, I don't know if I can sell your boats. And I said, I have to care. I've got to care about what I'm doing. So he reaches it down in his desk, and he had multiple sclerosis, so he was always on crutches and stuff. He reached down, he threw me the keys to his truck and said, drive down to the bay, down to where the boats are all. He said, drive down there, stand up and overlook the port, pick out the 10 best looking boats, and then walk down and see whose name's on the back of each of those boats. So I took the keys, I drove down there, down by the fishery, right next to where the fishery was. And I looked out across the boats, I walked down, I read the names on the back, I drove back in, I threw him his keys and said, 9 of the boats were yours. I can sell boats for you. And I went to work for him. Now, this was November. I worked for 2 months. There's not many boats you can sell in November, but I learned the business. And the next 2 summers, I came back and I would make $2,000 to $3,000 a month selling boats. And that's how I put myself through college. That was the money I needed to be able to support myself and eventually my wife while we were in school. I want to tell one other story about about selling boats. I want you to understand how I made this, how I worked, and this is kind of how I lived my life. I had a person come in and they wanted to buy a boat. And they said they were going to camp on it out on the lake and do some stuff. And they had picked a boat out. Now, I could ask 3 or 4 questions and I knew how much they could afford. You know, where do you work? How long have you worked there? What's your job position? I knew how much they made. I knew what they could afford. This boat was a little outside what they could afford. And I kept telling them, why don't you buy this boat over here? This is, for what you want to do, this is a better boat. And they said, no, this is a pretty boat. Looks like a flying submarine, we want this boat. And I'm going, no, you really don't. And I said, you should buy this one over here. And they kept coming back and they kept pushing and pushing and pushing. Finally, they figured out a way that they could swing the finances and they bought the boat over my warnings. They went out on the first weekend, slept on the boat. It wasn't designed for that. The canvas above them leaked. He had a heart attack, ended up in the hospital. She came back with the boat on Monday morning and said, take it back. The problem was we had sold their trade-in boat on Saturday. We couldn't unwind the deal. There was no way to, because we'd already taken their boat in and sold it. So they were stuck, and she looked at me and she said, this is your fault. You sold me this boat. This is your fault. And I'm thinking, I told you not to buy it. No, you made us buy this boat. And I'm just going, oh man, I just felt terrible. I felt miserable. I knew that I hadn't forced it on him in any way. I'd tried to discourage him. But I knew how much she was hurting. And I was involved. I could have stopped it, and I didn't. And I said to myself, I will never do that again. Well, that was a tough year in the early part of the summer, and I hadn't sold very much. And our ward had a lot of debt to the stake and to the church for the welfare farm, for budget. In those years, you paid budget and stuff. And the ward was really in debt. And it's a poor ward. And that summer, they asked me to be the executive secretary to train the new bishopric because I was the only one who had ever lived in a ward. And these people had all grown up in branches and stuff. And the stake president said, you should train the bishopric. I said, I know nothing about training a bishopric. He said, but you were in good wards and back in Washington, D.C. and at BYU. You know how the church works. You train them. So I spent 3 months trying to train a bishopric as a 23-year-old executive secretary. But during that time, the bishop said, we've got to pay off these debts. And so he asked all the families in the ward to come up with $300. He said they could hold garage sales, they could do car washes, but he wanted every family to come up with $300 to help pay off this debt. So I said, yeah, it's a great idea. My dad will give you $300. But after a week, I was sitting there thinking, you know what? I'm really an adult. I'm my own family. I should pay the $300. Now remember, $300 was a month's salary to a college student in those days. It was a semester's tuition at BYU. It was not a small amount of money. And I remember that I was praying about it on a Friday night, and I just had this impression that said, you need to do this. Well, I had not sold very many boats during that time, and I did not have enough money to go back to college. And taking that $300 would take my tuition away, and I wouldn't be able to do it. And but I just prayed about it, and I felt like I need to do this. Now, I didn't have enough guts to write the $300 check, so I wrote a $150 check. I said, I'll do half this month and half next month. So I wrote the check for $150 on Friday night. On Saturday, Well, I need to say, a week or two before, a guy had come in. And he had said, he had gone around and looked at all this. This is right after these people had that bad experience. He looked at all the boats, and he picked this same boat that this other family picked. And he's going to use it to go out in the ocean catching salmon. I said, this is a terrible salmon fishing boat. This is a lake boat to pull skiers. This is not a boat you're going to take out in the ocean. This would be a terrible boat for that. Look at it, it's got carpeting all through it. You get fish guts and stuff all over it. This would be a disaster. You do not want this boat. Oh no, I love this boat. It's beautiful. I want this boat. I said, no. I took him over to this salmon fishing boat. Big, ugly lap strake sides and a big bow on the front. High walls. Looked uglier in sin. But it was a great ocean boat. And he said, I don't want that boat. It's ugly. I want this pretty ski boat over here. And I said, yeah, but that's a lousy. I said, look on the inside. It's all plastic flooring. There's fish tanks in the back. There's plugs to let the water, that you just hose it down. All the fish guts and the stuff just go out those back drain holes. Look at the deep sides. You're not going to have to worry about water coming over. Look at that front. You'll cut through big waves and you'll hardly feel it. That other boat will beat you to death out on the ocean. And I said, no, you want this boat. And he said, no, I want that boat. And I said, well, I won't sell you that boat. He said, well, you have to sell me that boat. I said, no, I don't. I said, I will not sell you that boat. And he got mad and he stormed out, slammed the door. Came back the next week and said, I want to buy that boat. I said, I will not sell you that boat. I'll sell you this other boat over here. I'll sell it to you in any color you want. I'll put any size motor on it you want. But I will not sell you this boat. I will only sell you this one. And he was furious. And he says, I'm going to go to your competitor. But he lived in Eugene and he came to the coast to fish. And he says, my competitor back in Eugene, he'll sell me that boat. I said, I'm sure he will. My guess is he doesn't care. If you buy the boat, he'll just be happy. But I am not going to sell you that boat. That is not a good boat for you, and I will not be the source of your pain. I said, I will not sell it to you. He gets mad and storms out of the place again. Later that afternoon, he comes back and he says, okay, I'm going to buy your boat, and I better like it. Well, in those days, we'd always take the person who bought a boat, we'd rig it out, and then we'd take it to wherever they were going to use it. So he was going to use it at this port about 25 miles north. And so he and I got in the car and we drove up to the port and we put the boat in the water and I took him out and I showed him all the things it could do and how he would use it in salmon fishing. It could turn on its end and we took it out in the ocean and went over the big waves and we came back in and I showed him all the different ways he could troll with it and things. And then I put him in the driver's seat and said, now you go do all those things that we just did. And so he went and did all those things. And afterwards, I said, okay, I guess that's it. We can go back into the dock. And he stops the boat, sitting right in the middle of the bay, turns the engine off, and he turns and looks at me and says, how much more money do you want? I said, well, what do you mean? It's already your boat. There's no more money. How much more do you want for this boat? This is the best boat I've ever had in my life. And I said, hey, you don't need to give me anything else. I am just happy that you got a great boat and that it's going to work for you. He said, I'm so thrilled. And he was just beyond himself. And we drove back in and he just kept effusively thanking me for this great boat. And I said, hey, I just hope you have a great time. Well, now this next Friday, that was on a Saturday. On the next Friday, I wrote the check that I was scared to write. On Saturday, I go in and a man comes in, asks for me by name, comes and finds me and says, ask me what I want to do with the boat. And I said, okay. And so I asked him, what do you want to do with the boat? And so he told me what he wanted to do. And he says, now tell me what boat I should buy. And so I said, well, I walked him back. And for him, he was a wealthy guy and had desires for a cabin with a flying bridge and all these wonderful things on a big 24-foot boat. And I took him back and said, this is the boat I'd recommend. He says, I'll buy it. And I said, why? He said, my friend told me to come down and ask you what boat I should buy, and then I should buy whatever you tell me. He says, I'll buy that boat. I had 2 more people come in that day. I sold, well, so I made almost $1,000 that day from people who came in and said, I'll buy the boat that you tell me to buy. They had all been sent by this guy. He had told them the story. So I'm thinking, well, Heavenly Father really blessed me. So I wrote another check for another $150. And the next week I wrote the other check and I turned it in for the $150. And that next Saturday, I made another $1,000 selling boats to people who came in from that man. I made about $3,000 that summer selling boats to the people that man sent to me. Now, I used that for the rest of my life, saying I will never, for the purpose of money, make a bad choice and do something that will hurt people or do something that's not best for them, because in the end it will hurt me and it'll hurt them. I will only do the things that I feel are important. So that's what I did for the rest of my life. And in all of my career, I would stand up for what was right. And I think it really impacted my career and the things that I was able to do. I studied chemical engineering, enjoyed it. It's a very difficult course of study, but I found it challenging and I enjoyed the people I worked with. I did have a problem though, because I extended my mission and I came back to school in January, they said, you're out of sync. We only offer our classes once a year. And so you got to go to a whole nother year of school. And I said, I'm not paying for a whole nother year of school. I'm paying 100% of my own schooling. I'm not paying for another year of school. And I said, isn't there some way I can do this? And they said, well, if you can take some of your prerequisites concurrent with your class. And if you do that, it is possible to take, but you're going to have to take 18 to 21 hours every semester. And I still had to work part-time while I was doing this too. And they said, but you can do it. And I said, okay, I'm going to do it. So I graduated in 3.5 years. And it was really a problem. There were classes that I would take that I'm really confused and struggling in the class right up till about 2/3 of the way through. And then I'd learn something in the prerequisite class that told me how all this stuff worked. Then I go, oh, that's what we've been talking about. Okay, now I can do it. That happened actually a lot. But I graduated in chemical engineering in 1970. Well, I should say I did graduate in 76. And I'll just mention one thing there, but I should mention that I got married. I graduated in 77, got married in 76. But I had been out interviewing for all sorts of jobs, and it was a good year for chemical engineers. I had 8 job offers, which is wonderful, and I could choose between them. But right toward the end, I got a call from Bob Witt. Bob was the recruiting manager at Dow Chemical. He was the stake president there at the corporate headquarters in Midland, Michigan. And he called me at home because he had seen a copy of my resume. And it talked about being at the lumberyard, and it talked about selling boats. And having a chemical engineer that was a successful salesperson is pretty rare. And he says, we have this sales engineering role we'd like you to apply for. I said, I'm not interested in it. I didn't go to college to go be a salesman again. And he said, no, you don't understand. He said, consumer sales, like what you did, is... consumer sales are like missionary work. He says industrial sales are like home teaching. And I thought, oh, I like home teaching. I don't want to go tracting door to door, but I like home teaching. I like working with people and helping them and solving problems. And I said, oh, okay, well, maybe I could be interested in that. And so I said, okay, I'll come up finally and interview. Because he talked to me for 45 minutes on the phone trying to convince me. And I just wanted to do homework because I was so far behind from all the interviews I'd gone on. So I finally said, okay, I'll come up and talk to you, mostly to get him to leave me alone. I got up there the next day, and all he did was pull out the stake records and show, or the reports, the stake reports, and said, look, your ward has 85% sacrament meeting attendance, 95% home teaching, 100% youth attendance, 100% primary attendance. You've got the largest seminary east of the Mississippi. So we had 2 small wards in that town, but they were dynamite. They had the best leadership of any ward I've ever seen in my life. Because they were all, the people there, most of the people in the ward worked for Dow Chemical or Dow Corning, and they were leaders in those big companies. And they were wonderful, amazing people. He said, you want to raise your family in Midland, Michigan. And so I ended up going on the interview. And then when my wife and I prayed about it, that's where the Lord wanted us to be. So when we graduated, I went to work for Dow Chemical. And we went to Denver. That was our first location. I finished my last final on a Friday in the morning. At noon, we got in a car and we drove to Denver. On Saturday, we went looking for an apartment. But we had a problem. We had spent every cent to go through college. We had no debt. Neither one of us had debt. And we paid for everything. Marcia's dad had offered to continue to give her $125 a month, which is what he was giving her. He said, we can continue to do that. And I said, no, if we're going to be married, we have to support ourselves. And he got kind of mad at me because he said, my daughter's going to have it. I said, your daughter will not suffer. We will do this. And later, he thought that was a pretty good deal. But at the time, he was kind of mad at me. But I said, we're not going to take any money. And my parents didn't offer anything because they couldn't afford to, even if they wanted to. So we go to Denver, but nobody will rent us an apartment because we only have $200. And they won't rent us. They won't rent anything to us. Because they want first and last month rent. And so I needed $400 to get first and last month rent. And nobody would rent to us. And so now so we go to church on Sunday and we fast and, what are we going to do? And we just don't know. So I go in Monday morning to work. And they introduce me around and they take me out to lunch. And then they say, well, do you have an apartment yet? And I said, no. And I didn't want to tell them that I couldn't get into an apartment. They said, well, you should go look around and find an apartment. And I said, okay. And I started to walk out. And they said, wait a minute, this might be helpful. And they gave me an envelope. And in the envelope was $400. And I said, is this an advance on my salary? And they said, no, it's just to help you get started. Yes! I ran downstairs. I called the trucking company whose truck was coming into town that afternoon. And they said, you have to unload your stuff this afternoon. And I had no place to put it. So I called them and said, go to this apartment complex, which is the one we like the best. And I drove over there. I went in and I signed the paperwork, gave them the money, walked out, and the truck was pulling into the parking lot, and we moved in. Now, it was years later when somebody asked me, when I told them that story, they said, why didn't you just call your parents and ask for some money? And I thought, they would have loaned us $200. That's all we needed was $200. And I thought, why didn't we call them? And I thought, we were just so committed to taking care of ourselves, it never occurred to us to ask our parents for help or to ask anybody for help. It never occurred to us to borrow the money because we just weren't in that mindset. And I always thought that was funny, is that for all those years, never had crossed our mind that we could have asked somebody for help. And we never did. And so it was interesting. But the Lord helped us, and we did ask Him for help. Like I said, we fasted and prayed. I worked at Dow Chemical for 30 years. Now, I did all sorts of things. I had 22 different jobs during those 30 years. I started off as a sales engineer in Denver, and I visited all of the after I spent 6 months learning about Dow and how to place orders and do different things. I then spent 6 months visiting all of the natural gas plants and refineries in the Rocky Mountains, over 5 or 6 states. And I did technical engineering visits to all of those plants, analyzing what their technologies were, and building a report of the 300 different plants that I visited during that 6 months. And then I took a job in Chicago, working for the organic chemicals group of Dow Chemical. And I had customers from downtown Chicago up to Milwaukee and Madison, Wisconsin, out to Cedar Rapids, down to Peoria, Illinois, and everything in between, and that was my territory. My largest account was Napa Brake Parts. The brake parts company sold all the brake fluid and brake parts to Napa, and I sold them all the brake fluid that was used in all the NAPA stores around the country. Another large customer was Cargill, who had a polyester plant near my home, and we sold them propylene glycol and propylene oxide and ethylene oxide and a number of different products that they used to make polyesters. I had companies downtown like Morton Salt Company, Natural Gas Pipeline Company, People's Gas, a number of different things. And I grew my business from about $2 million a year to about $10 million a year, and did very well. And then they came and asked if that technology work that I did in the Rocky Mountains, they were going to start a business based on the work that I had done there. And they asked if I would come and do that. And I said, I don't want to live in Houston. I want to live in Midland, Michigan. But they said, we really, really need you to do this. And Marcia and I prayed about it, and we agreed to go to Houston, and I started up the gas spec business. And I ran it globally while I was there, and we built it up before I left it, well, actually, for the first couple of years, I worked for the people who were trying to start it. And they took the business from $500,000 in sales at a break-even profit to $500,000 in sales and losing $5 million a year. And that's when I took over the business. And within 3 years, we had sales of $7 million, making 50% profit. And that business continued to grow. And when I left the company 25 years later, that business, still using the system I put in place, was a $150 million business, still making 50% profit. One of the most profitable businesses in Dow. So I worked in Houston. We had a great experience in Houston, loved being there and doing all the things, the family. And so we had one daughter, Margie, born in Denver. We had two daughters born in Chicago, Heather and Arlie. We had two children born in Texas, Becky and Allison. And then we moved in 1988 up to Midland, Michigan. While we were in Midland, we had three more children, Katie, Chelsea, and Lori. I worked at the corporate headquarters. I was a marketing manager over the Versine chelating agents and Quat 188. I did a number of strategic things that were very highly respected in the company. They made me a director of business research and ran all the business research department, and had great experiences there. Then they had me be head of strategy or senior strategy consultant. And then I was director of new business development, so the marketing director of new business development. All the new business projects, I was over the marketing people working in all those areas. Then I became a senior finance analyst, and a totally new area for me. I should mention that when I was in Chicago, I did go to Keller Graduate School of Management Executive MBA program and went to school at night while I was an Elders Quorum president, and got my MBA while I was there. I went to, as I did these different jobs at Dow, we moved through the different programs, had great experiences. Later I became the director of new business development globally. So I was in charge of all new businesses. I was the global business director. We started up new businesses. When I left Dow, there was over $500 million in sales on businesses that I had started up, and had a great experience with that. Later, they made me the director of staffing and learning. So I was in charge of recruiting globally for the new business development function and charge of training. I wrote over 32 training programs while I was at Dow, anywhere from an hour long to 7-8 days long. Wrote a number of 1 and 2 and 3 day long courses. So I was very involved in training. So my patriarchal blessing, which said, science, chemical engineering, engineer, to start up a lot of technical businesses. And then I moved more toward training and did a lot of training and things at Dow and in education. For the last 18 years that I was in Midland, Michigan, I would go out and recruit at BYU, recruited students off campus. I later became the director of strategy for all 122 divisions of Dow. Dow's like a $60 billion company, and I was in charge of strategy across all the businesses at Dow. And I would run programs to develop strategy at each one of the businesses. And that was a great experience. In 2004, China was taking away a lot of business in the U.S., and a lot of production was moving, or a lot of manufacturing was moving to China. And Dow was afraid that we were going to have to start shutting down our U.S. plants, because when you take a refrigerator or a lawnmower or a lawn chair and you move it to China, well, they don't buy the plastics to make those products anymore in the U.S. They buy them in China or the Middle East. And so we now had all these big plants to make these end-use products, and all the manufacturing was moving away, and so the raw material sourcing was moving away, and we no longer had any place to put it. So the company asked me to figure out how many plants do we need to shut down? What are we going to need to do over the next 10 years? And so I put together a really amazing, this was inspiration. Much of what I did in my career came from inspiration. But this was inspiration where I identified the 30 largest end-use product families and what plastics went into each one of them, and what the migration of manufacturing to other locations were. And these 30 products made up about 90% of the polyethylene and polypropylene that was produced, and of the alkanolamines and glycols that were being produced from the raw materials that were then sold out into these end-use products. And one of the things I found is by analyzing what migrates and what stays and figuring out how that would change over 10 years, I came back in and said, you don't need to shut down anything. I said there might be some temporary times that you're a little over capacity. I said, but you don't need to shut down anything. In fact, you're going to need to build 2 or 3 more plants in the United States in the next 10 years. They said, that's ridiculous. Nobody is saying that. That is totally against everything anybody is saying. I said, well, here's the data. And I showed them the way that I had figured it out. And they just said, that's crazy. And they said, well, what about China? They said, do we have to build plants in China? Because we were currently building plants in the Middle East where the raw materials were cheap. And in China, it was expensive to build, and the raw materials were expensive. And I said, nope, here's data I've come up with that says, even though they're building 10 major ethylene crackers to make all these chemicals, it will not be enough to meet their needs over the next 10 years. So they're still going to have to bring in stuff from the Middle East, and you will not be stopped from selling there because you're importing stuff. Well, everything I came back with was totally against everything they had heard. Well, guess what? It's now been 10 years. And Dow never shut down their plants, and they're building 2 more right now. Or they've already built 1 and they're building 2 more. We're still selling everything to China from the Middle East, no problems. And everything that I said came true, even though it was totally against everything that was being said in the industry by all the soothsayers and the forecasters. And I've always been really proud of that work that I did. I thought that was great. The last thing I did before I left as the head of strategy, as well as continuing to do strategy for all the groups, I also did a company-wide look at which products should be sold just as a product, like people just buy ethylene glycol and they use it in a car, or they use it to make polyesters, and which products are sold to us a market-facing unit. In other words, they're bought by a car company or bought by a fabric company, and we're trying to solve the problems of those. Which products should be sold as market-facing and which should be sold as product-facing. So I spent 3 years working with about 15 teams at a time, analyzing all of the markets in the world and determining which ones we would use as product facing and which ones we'd use as market facing. And based upon that, they changed the whole layout of the company. So I felt really good that I'd had that kind of impact and the things that I did, and found a lot of joy in that. During the time in my mid-40s, had always felt that I needed to go to, I had this impression that I needed to work at BYU, that I needed to help the students there. And I knew that the students had very poor work experience, but they were great students. And I would recruit people and they'd be the top recruits, but their resumes were weak. And I kept having this impression that I needed to be there. But I wanted to make sure that I had enough money to last, because I wasn't sure I could handle an academic environment. It's pretty arrogant. There's a lot of things that I wasn't excited about being in that kind of an environment. But as I prayed about it and thought about it, I finally said, okay, for about 10 years before I retired, the people in the Ned Hill and Lee Perry in the business school had been encouraging me to come work there. And I kept saying, not until I have my full retirement. So finally, when I had planned my full retirement, I was going to stop working in December of 2007. I said, I can come in January of 2008. And I told them this a year in advance because I know how long it takes universities to do stuff. And so they came to me in February and said, we got a job we want you to do right now. And I said, no, I told you I'm not coming until December. And during that same time, the Polynesian Cultural Center in Hawaii contacted me and asked me if I'd be interested in being the head of marketing there as kind of a retirement job for me. And I said, well, my wife likes Hawaii. And so we talked about it. And so I kind of kept talking to BYU and them about this, but it kept taking longer and longer and longer for the BYU job, which is good for me because I told them I couldn't come anyway. Finally, the Hawaii people said, well, could you come in and at least put it in part-time during the summer while you still work for Dow? And I said, well, I got a lot of vacation with Dow. I could probably do that. And so I said, well, I'd consider that. So I told BYU I'd consider the same thing. And so in July, they came to me and said, okay, yes, we'll let you just work part-time until December so that you can, because we want you to do the job. So I finally agreed to do that. And so in early September, I started for 3 months. I worked at both Dow and at BYU. And so I became the director of experiential learning. And I was over MBA field studies where we did consulting projects for company. When I started, they had to give me a $45,000 loan because the person before me had run out of money, couldn't operate the program. And I had to take a loan to get through the first semester. But we quadrupled the number of projects. We raised the price from $5,000 to $15,000 and quadrupled the number of projects. And in the 9 years that I've been there, we've generated over our costs because we pay the professors and we pay people to be involved at the MBA level. But I've raised over $1.5 million above my costs during those 9 years and had projects for lots and lots and lots of students. Because I was generating such an excess, I asked if I could start doing the same thing for undergraduates where I wouldn't be able to charge because people aren't going to pay for that. I didn't have faculty who could help them. And I created a program called the On-Campus Internship Program. And we started with 5 projects, 3 in New York, 1 in Salt Lake, and 1 in Hong Kong. And we trialed and piloted the program. It worked. So the next semester we did 20 projects and 100 students because we had 5 students working on each team. Next semester we had 30 projects and 150 students, and it just kept growing. Last semester we had 800 students from 88 different majors. We do projects for businesses in every kind of area, and we had students from every college on campus. And because I determined that I was going to retire after 10 years at BYU, which will be next September, they are hiring 2 people, and they will both be hired next week. They'll hire 2 people to replace me, and they'll spend a year working with me to transition because of the complexity of it. And I feel really good that the program will continue after I leave. And we put a lot of things together to make that successful. I've enjoyed immensely working with the students and the things that's been able to to do. So I was born, raised in the church as a member. I loved the church. I loved everything about it. I studied about it. Again, I talked earlier about being a student. And so the teachers would have review sessions where they would review the previous 10 or 12 lessons. And because I would know all the answers, they would split the class with me against the rest of the class. And often I would win with all of the points and the rest of the class none. So I really knew stuff. I learned, I studied, I read the scriptures. I was memorizing scriptures at a very young age. I cared about this stuff and I really believed it. By the time I was 12 or 13 years old, I often would be my own teacher. So the class wouldn't have enough people to have teachers. So they would ask me to teach my own class. So at 14, 15, 16, I was often the teacher of my own class, and I would teach my fellow classmates, and I would be the teacher of the class. At one point, I was my own priest quorum advisor, priest quorum advisor, explorer leader, and my own Sunday school teacher. And I would teach, and I was teaching primary during the week. So very involved, little branch. You do what you have to do, and I enjoyed all that stuff. I was very, very involved in that. At the age of 16, I was called as the stake dance director, and so we would have World Dance Festival. So you'd have a stake dance festival, a regional dance festival, and then if you were good enough, you'd go to the World Dance Festival in Salt Lake. So I had gone to that when I was 14, loved it, had a great experience, and I loved dancing. I love choreography. So they called me as the stake dance director with another young lady, and we choreographed the dances because one of ours was the one we choreographed, and taught this. And we would meet every week, and I trained all the students, all the other youth in the stake how to dance, and then we went to the regional dance festival. We were selected to go to the all-church dance festival. And on the number, which was the original choreography number, some television station was broadcasting the World's Dance Festival, and I was told later that they selected our stake dance group as the one stake they showed the entire choreography of, because we had designed it to be seen from above. We knew it'd be in a football stadium, so we had them forming X's and evolving and then out to a circle and moving within it and then collapsing and opening back up, and a lot of things you could see from high up. And so they actually picked ours as the one they showed for the entire dance. And so I loved doing that kind of stuff, and I ended up teaching dance at my high school. I would teach people how to dance and do different things, and loved to do that kind of stuff. We also had a problem. This is the 60s. And a lot of loud music, a lot of hippies and different kind of things. And so people were very uncomfortable with dances. You know, how much light should you have? How loud should the music be? We would have live bands come to the church and play for our dances. And people would just go up and turn people's amplifiers off. And members would go up and to a young girl and tell her, your dress is too short, you have to leave. Even though they really didn't have any authority to do that, they would go up and stick a Book of Mormon between two youth who were dancing and say, you're dancing too close. And they just all sorts of things like this. And they made it a uncomfortable experience for the youth that were there. So I was the Youth Council Committee Chairman as the priest quorum first assistant. So I brought the group together, and we went to the bishop and said, we don't think this is good. We don't think this is working well. They said, we're supposed to be the ones leading our groups. We know who is sensitive. We know what the issues are. So here's what we want you to do. We want you to tell all the other youth leaders that when we're at a dance or when we're at any kind of an event, if they have a problem with one of the youth, that they come to the quorum president or the class president for that youth, and that will be their responsibility to resolve it. And if they're having trouble, then they come to me as the person over the whole thing, and we'll handle all those issues. If you don't like the lights, if you don't like the music, if you don't like what a student's doing or a youth is doing, You come to us, we'll take care of it. And he said, that's a really good idea. And so we did. We took over everything, and all the problems went away. Some of the parents, sometimes we'd get people with contradicting. We'd say, as leaders, you guys go resolve how you're, the fact that one of you wants it louder, one of you wants it softer. We're not going to have you going up there and fighting with the band. You guys work that out with us, and we'll come up with an answer that we'll then implement. And it really worked out well. And it was really kind of my first experience in saying, we need to not just let people do whatever. We need to have the ecclesiastical order. And I liked that kind of leadership that we had a chance to provide. And so I loved working in the church in that sense. When I graduated college, one of the things I considered doing was to be a seminary teacher. So I took all of the classes necessary to be a seminary teacher. But then when I realized that seminary teachers made less than half of what chemical engineers did, and I still wanted a large family, I said, well, I can teach early morning seminary, because I went to 4 years of early morning seminary. So when I moved to Denver, they asked, I met with the bishop, and he found out that I was a qualified seminary teacher. So they immediately called me as a seminary teacher. I had 40 students in my class, and it was a great seminary, just a wonderful. But they met at 5:30 in the morning, and we were 30 minutes from the church. So I had to get up at 4:30 or earlier, somewhere between 4 and 4:30, to go to seminary, and while I was starting my brand new job. And that was a real burden on us, but I loved teaching it, and it was a great experience. But when we left Denver, and Margie, our oldest, was born there, but when we left Denver and went to Chicago, somebody in that ward knew somebody in my family, and so before I even got there, the bishop was aware that I taught seminary. And he asked me about that, and I said, the truth is, I said, your seminary starts at 5:30 in the morning, and we still live 25 minutes from the church in Chicago. And I said, I got to be truthful. My wife's pregnant with our second child, and I don't even know my wife and daughter. We've spent very little time together because I get up at 4 in the morning. I come home not at 6 or 6:30. And I don't come in home between seminary and work. And then by 9 o'clock, I've got to go to bed. And so my wife and I spend very little time together. And I sleep in till noon on Saturday because I'm so tired from the week. And I'm going to be traveling to my new job, and I just don't think seminary would work. I need time with my family. And he said, well, I appreciate you sharing that with me. And so then the next week I come in, and he said, we'd like to extend a call to you. And I said, great. And he said, we're going to call you to be the seminary teacher. And I said, you remember all that stuff we talked about last week, right? And he said, yep. And you still are going to call me to be the seminary teacher? He said, yes. And I said, well, then I don't have any option but to say yes. So I became the seminary teacher again, and went through the same kind of issues that I did before, but we were committed to it. And I had a great experience. I loved teaching the kids, and it was great. But he came to me about April and said, how's the seminary going for you? And I said, well, it's great. We're really enjoying it, love doing it. I said, but I'm going to start an MBA this summer. And it'll be really difficult to be working on an MBA, working for Dow, and teaching seminary. He says, well, you don't have to worry about that. He says, because we're releasing you as a seminary teacher. And I said, well, don't release me now. I've only got a month left of school. He says, well, it'll be hard for you to do as the Elders Quorum president. I don't think you're going to be able to do. And this guy was really interesting. He was the controller for a very large, Arthur Andersen, a very large corporation, a very executive kind of guy. And he basically said, I don't do counseling. He said, people want to confess their sins and stuff, that's great, but marriage counseling for people who are struggling with sin, he says, that's Melchizedek priesthood. That's the Elders Quorum president. You have 100 families, you're responsible for all the counseling and all the financial issues and any kind of issues that come up, they're yours. So I would spend 2 and 3 nights a week out till late at night counseling and meeting with people of the 100 families that were in my Elders Quorum. And it was, but it was a great experience. I did that for a few years, and basically the whole time I worked on my MBA, I was also Elders Quorum president and had great experiences with that. Then I was called to be one of the 70. In those days, they had 70s in the stake. So I was called to be one of the 7 presidents of 70 in the stake, and I became the stake mission president. And did great things there. My wife and I were committed in the gospel to doing whatever was needed. And so one example of this was, we had, much as I mentioned in the previous story, they had building funds, and they had stake welfare budgets, and they had ward budgets, and we were building a number of new churches, and they were trying to raise all this money, and they kept asking us to increase and increase and increase what we were giving. And we got up to where we were giving about 5% of our income in all of these kind of extra things beyond tithing. And then the stake president came and had a meeting with all the leaders in the stake, and he asked us all to double what we were doing. Well, we were already doing 5%. We were a young family with 2 small kids in our first house trying to get by, and he asked us to double. So that means we would have been putting more than 10% into those things, plus 10% to tithing. That was a major, major sacrifice for us to do that. But we prayed about it and said, if our priesthood leader asks us to do that, we're going to do it. And we did. Now, we received, I believe, a number of blessings associated with that. But after about a year, the church did away with budgets. And that was the biggest raise I ever got in my life, was the year that the church did away with budgets, and all of those things that I had been paying went away. But the Lord blessed us during that time, and I was happy that we did it, and felt good about those things. I've done a lot of callings in the church. After I was stake mission president there, I became the young men's president in the ward. We had a really interesting ward. We had 30 kids in the nursery, 175 kids in the primary, 2 quorums of deacons, 5 teachers, and 1 priest. This was a BYU ward 10 years later. So basically everybody was near the same age, and the families were about the same size, and so we had this young ward. So I thought about taking that 1 priest and just having meet with the teachers. But when I prayed about it, I didn't feel good about that. So I said, now the 1 priest we had was inactive. So I went to him and said, I'm your priest leader, you need to be at church and come on. And so he agreed to come. And we started talking about, in the first class, we talked about Moses 139. For this is my work and my glory, to bring to pass the immortality and eternal life of man. And he and I spent 3 weeks looking at how that mission of Christ touched every aspect of the gospel. And at the end of those 3 weeks, as we were ready to move on to lesson 2, he said, this is fabulous stuff. He said, somebody else needs to hear this. I said, well, there aren't any other priests. He said, yeah, but Joel lives in our ward. And I said, who's Joel? He said, well, his parents, his dad was inactive, and his mom joined the church about a year, and they both became active. But Joel wasn't active. He says, Joel's a priest. And Joel White was his name, and said, he needs to hear this stuff. And so we went and talked to his parents, and we invited him, called him and invited him, and he didn't come. So we talked to his parents and got permission and got a key to his house. And they lived not far from the church. So we drove over during priest quorum and went into the house, got a key, went into his bedroom, woke him up, and taught the lesson in his room. And then said, we'll be back next week, unless you want to come to church. If you come to church, then we'll just have the lesson at church. But if you don't come next week, we'll be here again in your bedroom. And we left. Next week, he was at church. And we had a great experience, and he joined the church. Both of them served missions. I ran into Joel when I visited my brother. Now, this was in Houston, Texas. I ran into Joel when I visited my brother in Spokane, Washington. He was my brother's bishop. And actually, I met him before he was bishop, when he was young men's president. And he was so happy to see, and I was happy to see him, and we talked about our families and stuff. And then I came back later, and he was my brother's bishop. But he would tell his young men the story of how he joined the church. And, when you just do what the Lord wants you to do, great things happen. And so he was a good example of that. I went on and served on the High Council, and then I went up to Midland, Michigan, where I served both on the High Council and Stake Mission President. And I did that for 4 or 5 years. And then I was continued on the High Council till I had been on there 7 years. And at that point, I was called into the stake presidency, and I served there 9 years. Now, Midland, Michigan stake, Michigan looks like a mitten, took in all of this part of Michigan, plus northern Michigan and into Canada, 8 hours north into Canada. So we had buildings that were 5.5 hours north of us, and then members that lived 8 hours north of that. So it was a very large stake, and we had 17 units, and we would visit all of these units all across the stake. And you put a lot of commitment into serving in that large of a stake. And I served for 16 years either as a high councilman or as a stake presidency, and had wonderful experiences. Baptized lots of people, built new units, counseled with lots of people. It's a wonderful experience to serve in the church in that kind of a setting. When we left Michigan and came here, Marcia and I were called as the Activities Committee Chairman. And living in Utah is very, very different than living in the mission field. That was a very, very difficult experience for us because when you would come into a new ward out in the mission field, everybody put their arms around. They were so excited for you to be there. Your kids were just grabbed and pulled into their classes. And we came here, and it was like going to a movie theater. Nobody talked to us, and nobody cared that we were there, and nobody put arms around. And that was a difficult situation, and particularly for my daughter, who was a sophomore in high school. And all of the girls, so there were no MyMaids. She was the only MyMaid in the ward. And there were 10 Laurels, but they were all seniors, and none of them wanted anything to do with her. And there were 2 Beehives, but they were 2 years younger than my daughter. And that was it. That was all there was, and she was kind of on her own. Difficult time for us to adjust to a Utah style, because it's just nothing like what we'd ever experienced before. But we did. We adjusted. Marcia and I called as Activities Committee Chairman, and we started doing all the kind of activities we did out in the mission field, which was totally different than anybody was used to. We were having dinners of 4 couples that would meet for 4 months in each other's houses and then split and do another 4. And people were getting to know each other. People were having experiences. When a missionary came home, we had cultural nights where they would present about the experience on their mission and the culture of the people that they had met. And nobody had ever done these kind of things before. And so we did a lot of things that they still do in our ward 9 years later. But we're only there 6 months in the activities. And then I was called as Stake Young Men's president. Had some great experiences there. Had a lot of success. When I came in, the stake mission president, or the young men's president, was not allowed to visit the wards, and I was not allowed to hold any activities because they said, well, we don't need stake people. Everything's done at the ward level. Well, that may have worked when you had 100 or 200 youth in a ward. We had wards in which there were only 3 young men or 5 young men. Very different experience than when these wards had a lot of young families, and now they're older families. So we had to make some changes in the way we did stuff, and the stake president was hesitant for us to do that. It took me 3 years, but by the time I left, we were having 12 activities, 12 stake-sponsored activities a year. And we were involved in a lot of things, and it was interesting. The stake president said when we left, he said, I've looked over, because he was put in just about the same time he put me in. He said, I've looked over our records over the 4 years that I've been in. He said, there's only one statistic in the stake that has improved across the 4 years. He said, everything else was good, but it was flat. He said the one thing that's changed over those 4 years was our young men attendance has significantly increased across that time, and across all the units, all the wards. And we think that the Stake Young Men's presidency had an impact there, and I think we did, and we were happy about that. I was released from that. He wasn't happy when I was released, but I was called to be a bishop of a young single adult ward. My wife and I loved serving in the young single adults. That was a great experience. Spent 3 years there. She taught the temple prep classes and the family relation classes, and I was the bishop, and we did activities with all the youth, and it was a great experience. Provo YSA 8th Ward in the Provo YSA First Stake. When we were released, we were very sad, but not long after that, they invited us to come back and teach Institute. So we would teach Institute at a stake level in that same stake, and did that for a couple of years. When we were also called to be temple workers, and so we would teach Institute one night and work in the temple the next night, and we enjoyed that. After a couple of years, they said they limited how long you could do that Institute, so we ended that, but we still teach primary together, and we still work in the temple together, and enjoy that. My wife has spent her life with young children. She spent a lot of time in the primary, and loves children, and our 8 daughters are wonderful and are all active. They've all the 6 of them that are married were all married in the temple. 6 of them served missions. They served missions my wife served a mission in Peru, and my daughter served missions in Argentina, Paraguay, 2 in Brazil, and 1 in Chile. And then we had a daughter serve called to the South Carolina mission. So we've all been involved in the church, and we all love that kind of stuff. So I have a testimony of the gospel of Jesus Christ. I believe that Jesus Christ is my Savior. I believe that He atoned for my sins, and that He has made it possible for my wife and I to be married for eternity, and for my children to be linked to me. And I can't imagine eternity without my wife and my children. And people have often said, don't you make a lot of sacrifices, and you have to keep all these commandments and things, and isn't that a problem? And I said, you know what? I've never regretted keeping a commandment. I think the commandments are a gift from Heavenly Father to us. They're a gift because they're the plan of happiness. Every commandment I keep makes me happier. None of them make me sad. But every time I break a commandment, I end up sad at some point. I've never been able to break a commandment that I didn't end up regretting those actions. But I've never kept a commandment that I regretted. I've told people, I said, if for some reason, I don't believe this is going to be the case, but if for some reason when I die, there's either nothing or it's nothing like what we've talked about, and it's not, the Mormon church has nothing true about it or whatever. If that were to happen, I do not regret for 1 minute $1 of tithing, a hour of service, a meeting of worship. I don't regret for 1 minute any of the stuff I've done, because the blessings that I've received during this life have been worth everything for anything I've done. And then anything that comes after this, which I believe will be there, that's all just gravy. I believe that what has happened in my life validates everything I've ever done in the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I absolutely believe it. I believe in a prophet. I believe in the apostles, and I follow their counsel. I don't rationalize it. I don't question it. I believe it, and I act on it. And I've never regretted doing that. I don't lead blindly, because I figure things out. I spend time to understand it. But the difference between how I look at it and how some others is, while I'm figuring it out, I obey it. And then if I ever found out that something wasn't right, I guess I'd have the chance to go against it, but I've never found that. I've never found that anything I've ever been asked to do have I found reason to believe that I shouldn't. So I do have a testimony, and the church is an immense part of my life, And I'm very, very thankful for it, for everything that it's been for me and my family. So we're going to talk a little bit about my experience in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Critical part of my life, encompasses almost every aspect of things I've done in my life. I grew up as a member of the church, but my parents weren't. My parents were both converts. My dad, James C. McCarty, born in Oklahoma and largely raised in Arizona. During his my grandfather, James Robert McCarty, was a ranch manager. So he would work for different ranchers in managing their cattle herd or the other ranch hands that worked on the ranch. And so my dad grew up in those settings. During his teenage years, he was in Sedona, or just south of Sedona, Arizona, where the Slide Rock is. And if anybody ever goes to the Slide Rock State Park, when you pull into the Slide Rock State Park, there's a building for the park rangers and stuff. And then there's another building to the side, which is a large, it kind of looks like a barn, and they use it for storage. Well, that's the house my dad lived in. And Slide Rock is a trough that looks like a water park tube, but it's just in live rock, right? Just in the river. And so my dad says he would come home from school and ride the Slide Rock with his books over his head. And but he grew up there. They later moved to St. Joseph, Arizona, which happened to be a very highly Mormon community, about 98% Mormon. My dad was 18 and found that none of the girls would date him because he wasn't a member of the church. My dad's not stupid, so my dad became a member of the church so the girls would date him. Once he left St. Joseph, he didn't go to church anymore. I don't know all of the details behind that, but he stopped going to church. He later went down to Silver City, New Mexico, and worked in a copper mine down there, a copper mill. It was around this time that he wanted to join it was World War II, and he wanted to join the service. But he had been in a motorcycle accident and broken his back just a year before and had been in traction for 6 months in the hospital. They said his back wasn't strong enough or they couldn't put him into the military. Now, I've watched my dad pick up refrigerators and carry them across the room. He's 6'4" and 250 pounds, and he's solid muscle, and my dad was very strong. But that was the rule they had, and they wouldn't let him in the service. So they first told him they wouldn't let him in because he worked in the copper smelter, which was a war-critical job. So they said you can't leave a war-critical job to join the service. So he quit the job so he could get into the service. Well, they filled that job immediately by people who didn't want to be in the service. And so then when he couldn't get back into his job, he got on his motorcycle and he drove from New Mexico to San Francisco and went to work in the shipyards, which is where he met my mom. While he was working there, both of them were working, and they both happened to be living with relatives. My dad with his aunt and my mom with her grandmother, and they were next door neighbors. And my dad had fallen off the roof of the house. He was helping her repair something, and he broke his jaw, and it was wired together, and he had to recover at home, and he couldn't eat. So my mom would come over during the time that she had available, and she would feed him through a straw to help out the neighbor next door, and that's how she met my dad. But as my dad went back after the war was over, he went back to Durango, Colorado, and my mom went back up to Everett, Washington, where she had been living previously. And they communicated, and eventually through the mail and phone, they got engaged. And they came back to San Francisco to marry, and then went back to Durango. While they were living in Durango, and my oldest brother had been born, my dad was acting as a short order cook. He had also helped build the $1 million highway that runs from Durango up toward Denver. If you ride it, most of the people have at least one person in the car that throws up. It's a hairpin curves right on the edge of the mountain. It's a very interesting road. But my dad was involved driving heavy equipment and building that road. But he was working as a short order cook at the time, and a home teacher found him and invited him to come back to church. My mom was a devout Lutheran. Her family was Pentecostal, but she had found the Lutheran church and was committed to the Lutheran church. But she said if my dad would go to church, she'd go with him. So he said, well, if I'm going to go to church, I'm going to go to my church. So she didn't even know he had a church, and so then they started going. They moved about that time up to Coos Bay, Oregon, where my mother's father had moved for his health. He had a brain tumor. And they lived there in Coos Bay and had different jobs working for a uniform company who rented uniforms. He had a country band, and he sang in the country band, and they did concerts and things. He sold roofing materials door to door. So he did all sorts of crazy things until he became an assistant manager at the local Western Auto store. It was during this time that my mom would attend church with him. And because it was a little branch of about 35 people that was covered about a 100-mile radius around that spot on the coast of Oregon, she helped out and she did stuff, but she attended for 5 years without joining. Most of the people there all thought she was a member. She was the primary president, but not yet a member. It was at that point that somebody said, you really should read the Book of Mormon. So she said, okay, I will. So she read the Book of Mormon and gained a testimony and was converted and was baptized. A year later, they were married in the Idaho Falls Temple, and she was pregnant with me when she was married. So I have 2 older brothers who they were sealed to, but I was the first of the children born in the covenant. And we had 7 children, 5 boys and 2 girls. I told you I'd tell you about my mom. Her family goes back mostly to England and Scandinavia, the Drake family in England and the Sackerson and Beach families from Finland and Sweden. And my great-grandmother spoke Finnish, but came from a little Swedish town on the Finland border, and they spoke Finnish in that town even though it was in the country of Sweden. And then my great-grandfather was in Finland. And they came to the U.S. and went to Montana. That makes sense. I was in Finland last year, and I can see why they'd go to Montana, cold and northern. And he worked, they had a hotel there, or they did different things. But my grandmother's mother died, and Register, I think was her last name. And she, they remarried, or maybe they remarried to a Register. She was very cruel to my grandmother, and at the age of 14, she left home and went out and worked in a hotel as a cleaning lady, and was on her own from 14 years on for the rest of her life. She married, and married a gold miner. He worked in gold mines underground, digging gold. And they moved to Leeds, South Dakota. He worked for the Homestake Mine up in the Black Hills of South Dakota near Rapid City. And my mom went to school there. She said they had coal oil lamps. They did their bath in an iron tub, or a steel tub. They had outdoor toilets. It was pretty. And she was born in 1925. My dad was born in 1919. So Dorothy Jean Beach, and she, my grandfather started to have a brain tumor, was having health problems, coal miner's lung, so he went to a couple different mines after he left Leeds, South Dakota, and went to actually a couple in Wyoming and one in Ogden. And then eventually said, I can't be a miner anymore because of the problems. And so he went to the coast. They went to Everett, Washington. and Snohomish. My mom actually graduated from Snohomish High. And then she worked in the Everett Hospital as a receptionist. And then when the war started, she went with my grandfather down to San Francisco. And that's again in Richmond, California is where she met my dad. And then I told you the story of how that worked. Now, we already talked a lot about my parents, and on my father's side, the heritage goes back into the Civil War and the Revolutionary War. Then it goes back to Ireland and Finland, as on my father's side. On my mother's side, it goes back to New York, and then from there back to England and to Sweden and Finland, our common ancestor areas. My wife's family came over during the Nauvoo period. They were converted. My wife's mother's family, the Mays, came over from England and came to Nauvoo, and then went on to Utah and settled in the Cache Valley. A lot of the Mays and Mons in the Cache Valley. Then because of polygamous marriages, my wife's grandfather was actually, I think, born in Cardston, Canada, or raised in Cardston, Canada, and then came back down to Baker, Oregon, which is where he and, which was another kind of Mormon settlement area, and he and his wife rode a motorcycle and a sidecar from Baker, Oregon to Salt Lake to get married in that sidecar that she rode, and then they drove back to Baker. And my wife, her parents were both from Baker. Her father grew up in Sandpoint, Idaho, north of Coeur d'Alene, but was living in Baker at the time. Wasn't a member of the church, and they married after her mother went to BYU for a year. When she came home that summer, she married Marcia's father. And they, like I said, he would go to church with them, and he supported her and got her up for seminary and did all that stuff. But he didn't join the church until she was, I think, 19. But they have a good family, and she had 5 girls and 2 boys in her family to match the 5 boys and 2 girls in my family. Now, I told you that I would mention about my wife. My wife and I actually met as freshmen. My dorm was having a buddy party. Now, my roommate had a girlfriend back in Idaho, and he would go home on the weekends to see her. But we were having a buddy party, and the buddy party was that you get dates for your roommates. And so blind dates for each other, with the idea that we'd do another one in the spring, and if your roommate gave you a lousy date, you had a chance to get back at him. So the point was you're supposed to try and get a good date for your roommate. Well, my roommate wasn't going to be there. I thought, great, I don't have to participate. I didn't need anybody to get me a date. But the guys across the hall said, no. You're the social vice president of the hall. You've got to go. You've got to attend. We'll get you a date. So I agreed to triple with them. And so the whole dorm was going to get together, sing Christmas carols and stuff. It was near finals at Christmas. And then we could go do whatever we wanted for our individual dates. So he set me up with a girl in May Hall, there in Helaman Halls. And so I went to pick her up. A lovely girl, very pretty and nice. And so I said, let's walk back over to where we're doing the caroling and stuff back at our dorm. And we started walking across the parking lot. And there was an icy patch. It was cold. And when we got close to the ice, I reached over with my gloved hand and took her gloved hand as we started to step onto the ice. And she shook my hand away and said, "What are you doing?" I was just trying to help you. She acted like I was attacking her because I took her hand. And my wife was, you don't hold hands unless it's serious. And so, okay, so now I'm really uncomfortable. Now she's made me really feel weird. We get there and I say, "Well, can I take your coat off?" And she said, "No." And she held her coat around her. I'm thinking, I'm not going to attack you. Why are you so upset at me? And well, she tells me later, she was just cold. But I'm thinking, we're sitting in front of a fire, and she's got this coat around her. I said, does she think I'm going to attack her? Now she's got me really kind of unnerved. And so afterwards, we're going to walk up and go to this foreign movie up on the far side of campus. And we're walking up the hill, and we've been singing. So, and I'm a carefree, I'm an actor, and I'm a singer. And so we're walking up the hill, and a couple of us are singing Winter Wonderland, and we're kind of dancing around with each other. And she's looking at me, walking back a distance from me like, what in the world? She's quite reserved. What in the world is wrong with this guy? And so I kind of thought she was a snob. And she comes from a nice neighborhood in Fort Worth and a little upper middle class and reserved. And I took that as snob. So I thought, man, I got a snob tonight. And so we're going up, and she's kind of making us mad. And a couple of the girls kind of got ahead of us. Well, the guys, there's these vents on campus. You can't do it anymore. But they used to be able to open them up, and there's tunnels underneath the sidewalks. So we dropped down in, opened it up, dropped down into the tunnel, closed the lid. And then the girls got down a ways. When they didn't hear us anymore, they turned around and we were gone. We're out on the quad, so there's no place for us to go. And they're all, what happened? And then pretty soon we laughed and jumped up out of the grates. And so now they're kind of mad at us about that. And we get there, and it turns out that we were going to this international movie. We missed the last showing. So now we have nothing to do. So now we're kind of getting snippy at each other and snipey. And we finally said, well, let's go get some ice cream. So we go and this is happening to everybody now in the state. This whole thing's degenerating. And we get over to the Cougar Eat, and we all get ice cream. And we're talking, and the guy that got Marcia Peterson, who set the date up for us, he's talking to his date. And he says something rude to her. And she takes her ice cream cone and pushes it in his face. And so he took his ice cream cone and put it on her head. Things are not going well. And I make some snide remark. And I'm not that, and that's not my style. I don't do that. But I made some snide remark about Marcia. And so one of them says, well, I like you, Marcia. And the other one says, I like you, Marcia. And then the second couple said, I like you, Marcia. I like you. And then they all looked at me. I went, That was, and I didn't do that kind of stuff. My mom brought me up better than that. So I'd never done anything like this on a date in my life. This was not going well. So we're in a little Volkswagen Bug. And so now we're going to take everybody home. So we got the three couples, and we all get in the Bug, and Marcia has to sit on my lap in the back seat, which she wasn't comfortable with, and I wasn't comfortable with. But so we dropped off the first couple, so now we can sit down in our each seat, and the other couple's in the front seat. And we're going down the hill toward Helaman Halls, and the driver, which is the ice cream couple, is the one that's in the front seat. He says, well, do you want to do something? And the girl beside him says, I either want to go make out or I want to go home. And I said, well, if you guys are going to make out, would you take me home first? Because I don't want to. So this wasn't going well. So I end up walking her up to her door, and she says, well, I guess I had a good time. And I said, what date were you on? This was not a good time. So I get back to my dorm room, and I start realizing that I had been a jerk. I had been obnoxious. And that wasn't me. And I felt terrible that I had acted this way. I'd never acted that way ever in my life. And so I called her up to apologize, and she would not talk to me. She says, I don't ever want to see you again. I don't want to talk to you again. Don't call me. And so I thought, well, okay. So, I was really stupid, and I shouldn't have done that. Well, now these two guys thought this was the funniest thing in the world. And she was the roommate of one of their cousins. So we'd go to eat at Cannon Center or something, or I'd be getting food, and they'd see me and they'd wave me, come on over and sit with us. And so I'd come over and sit down, and Marcia would be sitting with him because she was sitting with her roommate, and he was sitting with his cousin. And then they would laugh. They thought it was so funny that Marcia and I were caught, having to sit together. Then we would be up on campus, and if I saw Marcia coming down the sidewalk, I would walk around a building to avoid walking past her. I mean, we did not like each other. So I go and serve a mission, and when I come back, she leaves and serves a mission to Peru. And she comes back, and I remember one of the elders quorum, counselor in the elders quorum president, came to me one day and said, I have this girl that I go to the temple every Saturday, a group of us do, and I really want to ask her to marry me. And we were served as missionaries together in Peru. And he said, but I'm kind of afraid. And I said, oh, go for it. You can't hurt anything. Go, ask her. Well, this was Marcia that I was encouraging him to ask. He brought her to church, and we met in the varsity theater. And I was the Sunday school chorister, so I sat on the stand. When she walked into the room, she saw me sitting on the stand, and she would not go down in the varsity theater where the people were sitting. She sat in the back row. She said, I'm not going down there because he's in this room. That was, we were both returned missionaries at the time. I almost never tell anybody this story, but I'm going to mention one thing. I was fairly frustrated as a junior that why couldn't I find a girl I wanted to marry? I always figured it was kind of like the song that said, if you can't be with the one you love, love the one you're with. That was a popular song in the 70s. And that's kind of how I was. Any girl I went out with, I liked her. And I enjoyed being with her. But when I was with a different girl, I enjoyed being with her. I didn't have one girl that I just wanted to be with her. And I couldn't figure out why. And so I said, I'm going to make myself, like a girl. And I'm going to force myself to do that. And I was actually really stupid because I was an engineer. And so I made a list. I made a list up of pros and cons, and I picked 5 girls. And I went out with them on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And then on Saturday, I decided which one I was going to marry, and I asked her to marry me. And she said yes. It wasn't Marcia at the time. This was before Marcia. And it was stupid that I did, because I didn't love her or anything, but I said I could learn to love her, because Spencer W. Kimball said in a devotional shortly before that, he said, any 2 people who are living the commandments can be happy. So I figured I could be happy if I could just make myself. Well, her mother didn't want her to get married, and she came from a non-member family, and the parents put a lot of pressure on her. So we ended up breaking off the engagement during the summer and said, well, we can talk when we come back next year. Well, before she came back, I got to school, and they came by my door and said, would you teach Sunday school? I was in the same ward the whole 4 years that I was at BYU. They said, can you teach Sunday school? And I said, sure. And so they gave me the book, and part of it was play a recording of Oh, How Lovely Was the Morning as part of this lesson. And I said, well, I don't have a recording of that, but I had a cassette recorder, and I knew that there was a girl on the other side of camp. I was on one side of Campus Plaza, and she was in the Mulestein House, which is now the Korean Cup Bop restaurant, little house there, but that's where she lived. And I knew a girl in there, Evelyn, had a piano. And I said, well, Evelyn will play it for me and I can record it. So I go over there and I knock on the door, and I ask for Evelyn. They said, well, Evelyn's not back at school yet. And I said, oh, I needed her to play the piano. And they said, well, her new roommate plays the piano. And so I'd bring her out. And I said, I'll charm her into it. Well, out comes Marcia. I go, oh, Marcia Peterson. And she goes, I said, listen, I know we don't get along. And I said, but I really need somebody to play the piano for me. Would you be willing to do that? I can come back in an hour or two, and would you be willing to do it? She said, yeah, I can do it for you. She was bored stiff. She'd been there a couple of days, had nothing to do. So she said, okay, I'll do it. Well, I come back, and we record it and get the playing, and she's kind of nice. And not what I remembered at all. And then she said, but you don't just want an instrumental, we should sing it. And I go, well, okay, would you sing with me? And she said, yeah. So we spent another hour, and we got it down, and we practiced the parts, and we sang the song. And, I said, I kind of like her. She said, and I'm bored. And so I said, I'm going up on campus. They're playing my favorite movie, the Errol Flynn version of Robin Hood from the 1930s. I love that movie. And I said, I was going to go up and watch it. Do you want to come? Well, she was bored, and she says, well, sure. So we go up and watch the movie together. And I'm saying, I'm having a really nice time. And I'm thinking, this is kind of crazy. And so I said, they're having a really neat concert tonight. She says, who is it? And I said, no, it's the Really Neat Concert, which is basically a talent show. And I said, so I got nothing to do. You want to go? And she said, sure. So I took her to the Really Neat concert that night. When I got back to my dorm, I had an atlas, and I opened it up, and I tried to figure out how would you have a wedding and receptions between Coos Bay, Oregon, Provo, and Fort Worth, Texas. I just, I don't know. It was just struck me. So she came the next Sunday. She sat in my class, and we had church at night. So after the church at sacrament meeting at night, I walked home with her, and and the next day was Labor Day, and I mentioned to her that I was going to go up and get card tickets for the football game. She says, "Well, I am too." Well, so why don't we go up and stand in line together? So we went and stood in line together and hung out a little bit, and then she said, "Well, tomorrow." Actually, that evening, I was trying to decide if I wanted to get an MBA or should I be looking for a job. And so I went on a walk with her. And she said, "Now, be careful. I don't want anybody to see us. I don't want people to start thinking we're dating because there's some guys here I'd like to date in the ward." And I said, "Okay, yeah, we'll just walk and talk for a little bit." So when we came back, the guy she most wanted to date was standing on the doorstep coming to visit her. And I'm bringing her back, and she wasn't happy about that. But she said, well, the next day was class. She said, "Do you want to study after class?" And I said, "Well, I have a night class that doesn't get done until 7:30. She said, "Well, I'll meet you after the class." In the meantime, I went and visited this girl that I had been engaged to. And we talked for a little bit, and but didn't, just talked for a little bit. So the next day, she meets me after class. She says, "I've been thinking about you all day, and that's a problem because this is my senior year. I've got to do a good job." And I said, "Yeah, I've been thinking about you too a lot." And she says, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" Well, being the engineer that I am, I said, "Well, we can either stop seeing each other, we can do something about it, or we can let it ride." She says, "I don't want to stop seeing each other." I said, "I don't want to let it ride." She said, "We should talk." So we drove up above the temple and up in Rock Canyon, and we talked, we prayed about it, and we came down the hill engaged. This is 3 days after a 5-year break after the blind date. This is 3 days, and we're engaged. Now, we're too embarrassed to tell anybody, because how do you tell anybody you got engaged in 3 days? But the Lord was very clear. We had to do it right then. This was not an option. Well, the next day, that girl called me up and said, "Let's get married right now." And I am a very loyal person, and I live by my loyalties. And I probably would have done it, except the Lord had already told me I'm supposed to marry Marcia. So I had to tell her no, and I married Marcia instead. And it was great. We didn't tell anybody because she says, "I need to warn my parents. I haven't even mentioned you at all." And my parents had brought my sister to school, and so they'd actually met Marcia at the Really Neat concert when we were doing that. And so she said, "Let me warn my parents." Well, we had about a week, and she hadn't really warned them at all. But we went to the ward opening social. Now remember, I'd been in this ward for 3 previous years. I knew lots of people. So as we're walking in, all these girls kept coming up and giving me a hug, guys shaking my hands, but girls would come up and give me a hug and say hi, and it's so good to see you again. And she's with me, but all this is going on, and nobody knows her because she's brand new in the ward. After about 30 minutes, she says, "Let's go." I said, "Well, we're just kind of getting started." She says, "We're going to go call our parents and tell them we're engaged." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because we're announcing tomorrow in church that we're engaged." Because she said, there were too many girls. And I said, "Oh, that's nothing. We're just friends." She says, "No." She says, "I know girls, some of those would like to marry you, and no, we're announcing tomorrow." So we did. And my parents said, "Oh, it's so wonderful. If Roger loves you, we know we'll love you." Her parents said, "When are you going to get married?" We said, "Probably Christmas." "When are you coming down to Fort Worth?" We said, "Well, we thought we'd come down at Thanksgiving." They said, "No, you'll come down this weekend." We said, "It's a 24-hour drive." He said, "You're coming down this weekend because It takes 6 weeks to order the wedding invitations. In those days, you had to order them. It takes 6 weeks to order the wedding invitations, and there's not enough time between Thanksgiving and December 18th to order invitations, and we're not ordering the invitations until we meet you. So we drove to Fort Worth. Now, Marcia and I did have a formal engagement with a ring and everything. That was a week or so later. Marcia and I went to the Provo Temple together. I arranged with some people there to have the ring put on the floral bouquet that sits in the middle of the room, in the celestial room. And so I had it all arranged. I had the ring with me. The people there were going to let me put it on the flower for Marcia to see. We get in there, and the stake president had neglected to sign Marcia's temple recommend. So she can't go in the temple. So I went and found the temple president. I explained, we're getting engaged today in the celestial room. Isn't there anything you can do to let her in? He said, well, I could give her an interview. I said, would you please? And so he did. He took her in and interviewed her, signed it. And then after the session, I came in first, and I got the ring hung. And I sat down right in front of it. So when Marcia came, she sat next to me. And I said, isn't that a beautiful bouquet of flowers? And she said, yeah. She looked around. I said, no. Isn't that a great floral? And she goes, yeah. And I said, look at that flower right there. Isn't that a pretty flower? She goes, oh. So that's when I asked her. So it was kind of fun. So I've often thought the Provo Temple, because that's where I had my endowments out, and that's where we got engaged. But Marcia's dad was a non-member until she was 19. And then he joined the church, and then a year later they went to the Salt Lake Temple and were sealed as a family. So Marcia wanted to be married in the Salt Lake Temple, and we were. We both came from large families, and we wanted a large family. And we didn't know how many we would have, but we always knew it would be one more. And we kept having one more until we felt that all of our children were there. And we have our 8 daughters. And being a one-of-a-kind family is an amazing experience. Now, my wife loves car trips. And my girls love car trips. And I did a lot of business where I covered the whole country. So I would take my family with me. If I had business in Seattle from Michigan, then I would drive sometimes to Seattle with the whole family, if it happened to be summer or spring break or something. And I would make calls in Seattle and Portland and in Los Angeles and in Utah and in Nebraska. And I'd just make a loop and do that. We'd have fun together. Our kids would sing in the car. I always thought it was really funny. They would do dance routines. We had a 12-passenger van, and they would sit in their seat and put their feet up on the seat in front of them, and they would do choreographed dance routines. And they'd have me play the radio, or they would sing like, I'm going to the temple and I'm gonna get married. And the whole car would just be rocking, and they'd be singing, and we had a great time. My kids have been in all 48 continental United States by car. They've crisscrossed the nation on Highway 10, gone coast to coast on 10, 20, 40, 50, 70, 80, and 90. And they've been north and south on 5, 15, 35, 55, and 75. So my kids have seen the country, and we love being together. Our kids, even today as adults, they look for every chance to be together and to be around each other. And they just have great experiences, and we have a very strong bond in our family. My wife's kind of a stage mother. Doesn't like to perform herself, but loves for her kids to perform. So every stake play, every thing that would go on, she would make sure her kids were in there. And I remember we were doing a Sound of Music kind of thing. And so they had my children be the ones that did the Do Re Mi song with me. And they had another scene where they needed a mother and her children. And so my stair-step kids, my 8 kids came following my wife as she walked across the stage. And she also built firesides. So while I was the stake mission president, she would build these firesides around Christ or around missionary work. And then we would go and visit all of the 17 units in the stake and put that fireside on. And And the girls would all sing, and they would have speaking parts, and they would do harmonies. And these are young girls that would do this, and Marcia and I would sing with them. And there'd be like an hour-long program. And then once we gave it all around Michigan, then when we traveled out west to visit family and stuff, we would do it in Montana and in Washington and Oregon and Utah, and we'd do these firesides all along. And after we finished kind of that kind of a route, then she'd write a new one, and then we'd go do it again around all that stuff. And so the family had a great time together. One of the things my family's known for is caroling. Because the girls have beautiful voices and because they love to sing, Marcia and I both in our families growing up would go caroling with our families. So when Marcia and I got together, the first thing we said was, well, it's Christmas time, we need to go caroling. Well, it was just the two of us. So we would go out and visit friends and church members, and just the two of us sing on their doorstep and give them a little gift or cookies or a little ornament. And then when we had a baby, we'd take the baby with us and hold her on the porch and sing. And as then we had a couple kids, and then they would sing with us. And pretty soon we had the 10 of us, and beautiful harmonies. Our girls could really, one of my daughters went to the state solo contest, and just beautiful voice. And all the girls sing very, very well. And so then we would go sing, and everybody loved. They would just, oh, I'm just waiting for you to come this year, and we're so happy that you come. And we would visit maybe 75 to 100 people. And these are families that some we had to drive 20 miles to that were members of the ward. But we would go out to family, friends, church, work, and we'd go sing to all of these people. And we'd drive to each house and get out. And it would take us normally 10 to 15 nights to visit all of these people during December. But we would go out and sing in all these places, and everybody loved it, and they always looked forward to us coming. And then as we started getting son-in-laws, we'd get more bass and tenors involved. And now we'll still go out at Christmas. And I have about 25 of my family lives here in the Utah Valley, and we'll go out with all 25 of us and sing to home. We'll go to each ward. Each night we'll have a different ward, and we'll go to those wards that my family lives in, and we'll go sing. And the kids just love it. And so those are things that make us happy. My children love water. They love ocean. They love lakes. Everywhere we go, we always take swimsuits because the kids love water. And I grew up near the ocean and lakes, and I love water, and my wife loves water. We've had a hot tub in our backyard, both in Michigan and Utah, for 24 years. I know it's 24 years because we bought it when my daughter, who's 24, was born. And we've had hot tubs in all that time, and now we have a swim spa that'll you can swim in it, or you can seat 15 people in it. And so we have both the swim spa and the hot tub, and we can get about 20 people out there or more in all at the same time. And we love water. Everybody in the family loves water. I mentioned that having an all-of-a-kind family is an interesting experience. And so one of the examples is we're driving across South Dakota. Now, if anybody's ever driven across South Dakota, you have to go and look at the Black Hills gold, and my wife and I have Black Hills gold rings. You have to go to Wall Drug, because how can you drive along I-90 and there and not go to Wall Drug, because it's just there's signs for it everywhere. And you got to go to the Corn Palace in Mitchell, South Dakota. They every year decorate it with corn cobs of different colors and things, and they decorate this building up, this Corn Palace. So we stopped in Mitchell as we were driving across there one time, and we stopped in Mitchell and had all the girls with us. And after we came out of the Corn Palace and we were looking across the street, there were two buildings. One was the Rifle Historical Museum, and one was the International Museum of Dolls. Now, the nice thing about an all-in-the-one family is everybody knows where we're going. It ain't the rifle. We're going to the International House of Dolls because that's what girls do. And so it was just great because everything we did, we didn't have this concern and fight about different styles. We were a girl family, and I was okay with that. I loved my daughters. In fact, I have to be truthful with you that after we had 5, we became quite concerned that maybe the 6th or 7th might be a boy, and that could be a real problem for us. And we were actually quite glad that the last 3 all ended up girls, because it kept this one-of-a-kind family and great experiences. And we've always loved all of those things. I mentioned South Dakota with my mom. I mentioned it with my wife's favorite kind of jewelry is Black Hills Gold. And I'm not sure if you can see that, but Black Hills Gold is distinct in that it has 3 colors of gold and 2 kinds of elements in it. So it's got pink, green, and yellow gold, which has to do with the contaminants in the Black Hills. And it has grape leaves and bunches of grapes. Now, why is that significant? The miner who originally designed Black Hills Gold was a miner up in the Black Hills panning for gold, and he got lost. And he ran out of food, and he couldn't find his way out of the Black Hills. And he's dying. I mean, he's starving to death. And he's got his donkey with him, and he doesn't know what to do. He can't find any food. And he comes to a stream, and in the stream, as he's drinking some water, he sees a grape leaf float down. And he thought it was a sign from God. He said, if there's grape leaf, maybe there's grapes. And so he got in the stream, and he walked up the stream until he found the bushes with grapes. And he ate his fill of grapes and took enough with him, and then followed the stream down out of the mountains and down into civilization. But he believed that God saved his life by having him see those grape leaves and then being able to eat the grapes. And so when he decided, I'm not going to be a miner anymore, but he became a jeweler, and he began making rings. And every ring he made always had grape leaves and bunches of grapes. Secondly, as a testimony to God, he had the Trinity, pink, green, and yellow, colors of gold, to represent the 3 parts of the Godhead. Now, I like the testimony that the Black Hills Gold. It's a testimony of God. It's a person's testimony that God is there to help us. I like the Black Hills Gold for that reason. I like it because it's my wife's favorite kind of jewelry that she loves and always has since she was a little girl. And my mother grew up in the Black Hills, and my grandfather was a gold miner in the Homestake mine in the Black Hills, which provides the gold that makes these rings. And so I find, as a memorial to my mom, she's still alive at 91, so not a memorial, but in honor of my mother, in honor of my wife, in honor of my testimony of my Heavenly Father. When I see that ring, I think of all 3. And so my wife and I have matching Black Hills Gold rings. My wife loves to travel. I'm not a big fan of travel all that much. I had to travel for my job. I worked very, very hard to not have to travel any more than I absolutely had to. It's hard to serve in the church and to serve in your family. I was in local choirs. I was in local plays. I served on board of directors of the Theater Guild. I served with the Music Society. I served as a commissioner on the Parks and Recs Commission for the City of Midland. I was on the executive council of the Area Council for Boy Scouts. I had a lot of things that I did, and traveling kept me from being around the people and the things that I wanted to be involved in. But my job required that I travel around the world, both around the U.S. and the world. So I would be very careful. Now, students would ask me when I recruited students out of BYU to come back and work for Dow, they'd say, well, how much travel do I have to do? And I'd say, well, part of that's your decision. I give them an example. I said, there are people at Dow who are going to go to Cleveland or Cincinnati, going to Cincinnati to make some calls, to visit some people. So they'll leave like on Monday afternoon or Monday noon, get there in time for dinner, go out for dinner, maybe catch a show or something. And then the next day, they'll have meetings all morning, have lunch with somebody, meetings in the afternoon, have dinner with somebody, maybe do some entertaining, go to a ball game or a play or something. And then the next day, on Thursday, they'll have meetings throughout the day. On Wednesday, they'll have meetings throughout the day and lunch and meetings in the evening or in the afternoon. And then maybe they'll take some time off in the evening to sightsee or do something like that. Then the next morning, they would catch a flight, and by noon or afternoon, they'd be back in their hometown. So they've been gone 4 days and 3 nights to make those set of calls. I would make that same set of calls by getting up at 4 or 5 in the morning, catching the first flight out of the day, getting to Cincinnati by 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning. And then I would make calls all day long and have lunch and make calls all afternoon and have dinner and entertain that night. And then the next day I'd have calls all morning, lunch with somebody, calls all afternoon. And then I would head to the airport. By 5 or 6 or 7, I'd be at the airport. And by 11 o'clock or midnight, I'd be back home. So I've been gone 2 days and 1 night. And the others were gone 4 days and 3 nights. And I said, so how much do you have to travel? Well, it depends on what you want. And you could do either. And I chose to do that. I traveled a lot around the world, to Asia and Europe and South America. And, I would try and come home. Now, here's an exception. So I had a set of meetings in Switzerland and Germany. And then the next week, I had a conference in Rome. And I planned to come home between. I have 8 daughters, and I'm in the stake presidency, and I have responsibilities. My wife says, this is ridiculous. You're not going to get home till sometime on Saturday. You're going to have to leave Sunday afternoon to get up there on Monday. You're just not going to be home hardly at all. Why are you coming home? And I said, well, I want to help with you and stuff. And she said, why don't you just stay? I said, well, what am I going to do? Well, you can go sightseeing around Rome and stuff. I'd never been to Rome. And I said, well, I don't want to do that without you. I don't want to do it by myself. And she said, why don't you go and scout out all the places you'll take me? Go see where you'll take me. And then when you come home, you can have a plan for the next time that we go. Now, she would normally come with me once every other year or something. And we'd go to London or Paris or Tokyo or Sao Paulo or someplace that we would go. And I'd take her on business with me. I couldn't do it very often because of all of our children, but every once in a while, I would take her with me someplace. So she figured Rome was a likely candidate for the future. So I said, okay, well, I guess I could do that. So on Friday, after my meetings, I flew to Rome, and I spent the whole weekend, and my conference didn't start till Tuesday morning. I would have had to fly in on Monday to be there for Tuesday morning, but so I had Friday afternoon or Friday evening, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. I could just go look. And I did. I went and looked. And it was just kind of like she was there. Because every place I'd look, Marcia's going to want to see this Sistine Chapel. This is, just beautiful. She's really going to love the Colosseum. And so it was great. So I went around. It was kind of like she was with me. And I really enjoyed it. It's the only time I ever remember sightseeing by myself that I really had a good experience. And then I never had another reason to go to Rome. And it was 15 years later. Finally, we said, we got to go to Rome just because we got to go. So we actually took a tour of Italy for 8 days and then did a Mediterranean tour to Istanbul and Spain and whatever. And so we did some of that. And she got to finally see Rome and all the things that I picked out for her. But we just did that as a summer vacation one time. But my wife loves to travel. So I've been to about, on business, probably 30 to 40 countries. When you throw in the sightseeing I've done with Herb, probably 50 countries. But she does love to travel, and I love to be with her. She's my best friend and who I like to be with. We like cruises. We like all-inclusive hotels. I found out that for me, now remember I told you earlier that my dad didn't have a lot of money, and so I grew up pretty, restricted on what I could do. And so I'm pretty careful about how we spend money. And I found that when I traveled, my enjoyment of the trip was inversely proportional to how many times I took my wallet out of my pocket. If I had to take my wallet out 5 times, I wasn't happy. If I had to take it out 10 times, I was miserable. If I had to take it out once, I was okay. So what I found out was that if I could pay for everything up front, like for an all-inclusive or for a tour where they would pay for it, and like when we went to Israel for 15 days in Israel and Egypt, and I paid everything up front, so I didn't have to pay anything else. I enjoyed the whole trip. If I had to pay every day for each hotel and each meal, and I would have been miserable. But I didn't mind putting the $10,000 down for the 2 of us for the whole time. And that was great. I was okay with that. It's just how often I had to do it. So I learned that lesson about myself. And so we try and find vacation settings where I don't have to keep pulling my wallet out. And that actually has been a good thing. This last summer, we went to Scandinavia. We went to Norway and Finland and Sweden and Estonia and Russia and had a great experience there. I mentioned that a couple of years ago we went to Italy and went to Spain and France and went to Rome and Florence and Verona and Venice and Paduf and Milan and Lake Como. Then we took a cruise that went around to Naples and to Mykonos, Greece, and to Athens, and to Istanbul, and to Ephesus. So I had a great experience and enjoyed doing that kind of stuff. We've been to most of the countries in South America. Partly we went to pick up our daughters. For each one of their missions, we would go and pick up our daughters and had a great experience in meeting all the people they had baptized and people they had taught and the families that had cared for them. And we loved going down and meeting. And we would take the other daughters with us to some extent so that they had a chance to see what those mission experiences were. And each of those then wanted to go serve missions. And so those were great experiences. So we've been to Argentina and Paraguay and Brazil and Chile and Colombia and Venezuela and Aruba and a lot of the countries throughout South America. Been a lot of time in Asia. Marcia went with me my last year of working at Dow. She went with me to Beijing, to Seoul, to Shanghai, and we have spent 2 or 3 weeks in Asia doing business things that I needed to do, and she came with me. We spent a lot of time all throughout Europe. We've been to almost all the capitals of Europe at one time or another, and enjoyed those experiences. I travel now just to make her happy, but luckily I don't have to do it a lot because we're both pretty happy in the things that we do. My kids believe I'm famous for the stories I tell. One of the reasons happened is we had a slumber party at our house, and one of the girls became very sad and morose and wanted to go home. Wanted to go, just sad and wanted to go home. And I said, well, before you go home, let me tell you a story. Now, I didn't have a story to tell. I was making this up as I go. So I said, this is the story about the cuddly snuggly. And she says, what's a cuddly snuggly? I said, you have to listen to the story and you'll find out. At that point, I had no idea what it was because I was making this up as I went. So I said, so Caroline and Margie, and the girl's name was Caroline. So Caroline and Margie and Heather and Becky and Ara were all going off they were on a hike. And they came to this little city and they noticed something strange about the city. The children were all sad. And they just sat on the street. They didn't do anything. And they asked the kids, what's wrong? Why aren't you doing anything? We don't have any toys. We don't have anything to play with. Well, why don't you have anything to play with? Because the abominable snowman came and stole all of our toys. And now we have nothing we can do. Well, I said, well, why don't you go back and get them? And they said, well, we're all afraid of the abominable snowman. And Margie said, well, I'm not afraid. And Carolyn says, I'm not afraid. And Heather says, I'm not afraid. And Arlie says, I'm not afraid. And in her little squeaky voice, Becky said, I'm not afraid, because she was the smallest of them. And so they said, well, where is this abominable snowman? They said, well, he's up on the top of that hill. So I said, okay, well, we're going to go up there. And so they came to the hill, and now they're a little concerned because they're not sure what's up there. So that once they got to the hill, they went step by step by step by step. And they looked to the right, and they looked to the left, and they didn't see anything. So they went on up the hill, step by step by step by step. And they got close to the top of the hill, and they looked to the right, and they looked to the left, and there was the abominable snowman. And they ran down the other side of the hill to get away from him. And they got down into the valley, and they said, well, now what do we do? Because the abominable snowman's between us and our home. And the kids were looking around, they saw a tree. And next to the tree, they saw something, and they heard crying. So they went over to see what this was, and it was something they'd never seen before. The person had the face of a China doll with makeup and everything on this ceramic face and beautiful long hair and the body of a teddy bear. They said, who are you? She said, I'm the Cuddly Snuggly. And I said, well, why are you the Cuddly Snuggly? She said, because I loved, they said, why are you crying? She says, because there's no children to play with me. I love children to brush my hair and put my makeup on and hug my body, and there's no children here. And I'm so sad because I have no one to play with. And they said, well, we know where there's lots of kids who would love to play with the Cuddly Snuggly. And they said, would you go back with us? And she said, well, I can't go over that hill because the abominable snowman lives up there. They said, we're not afraid. We'll take you. So they come up to the hill, and they go step by step by step by step. They get halfway up, and they look to the right. They look to the left. They see nothing. So they go step by step by step by step. They get to the top of the hill, and they look to the right. They look to the left. And there's the Cuddly Snuggly. There's the abominable snowman. And he grabs them all, and he takes them to their cave, and he puts them in there. And the kid said, why are you doing this? Why did you grab us? And he said, because I'm sad, because I have nobody to play with. And they said, why is everybody so sad? He said, because there's lots of kids down there. He says, I went down to play with the kids, and they all ran away, and they left their toys. And so I thought if I took their toys and brought them here, they would come up and play with me. But none of the kids ever came. Well, they said, aren't you going to eat them? Oh, no, I love children. I just want to play with them. And they said, well, we're taking the Cuddly Snuggly down to the city to play with the kids. Do you want to come too? He says, I'd love to come. So the abominable snowman, the Cuddly Snuggly, and Margie and Ara and Heather and Becky and Caroline all went down the hill, and they came to the city. And when the people saw him, they all started to run. And the kid said, no, no, don't run, don't run. He's friendly. He wants to be your friend. And so the kids all kind of stuck their head out and said, really? And they said, yeah. And he was carrying all their toys. And he gave them back all of their toys. And the children came and found the Cuddly Snuggly, and they started brushing her hair and hugging her and putting makeup on her face. And some of the kids took ribbons and put it on the abominable snowman and made a maypole out of him, and they started playing, and others got their toys. And everybody was happy. And Margie and Heather and Becky and Ara and Caroline said, well, our work here is done. And they went home after a very adventuresome day. And that's the story of the Cuddly Snuggly. And Caroline forgot all about going home and spent the night. It became a tradition after that when we had sleepovers, Dad would make up a story. And we had stories of the Sniggle Snort, and we had stories of the Cuddly Snuggly and the abominable snowman. And we would tell stories. And the kids that would come to spend the slumber party would ask to have stories by Dad, to hear some of these stories that we would tell. But you know what? They loved the same stories so much that we stopped making them up, and we just started telling those stories. And that's one of the stories, and we'll end with that. At my father's funeral, we sang, I'll go where you want me to go. I'll do what you want me to do. I'll be what you want me to be. I think that's the key message of finding happiness in this life and in the life after, is to go where Heavenly Father wants you to go, to do what He wants you to do, and to be who He wants you to be. Now, we talk about reading in the Scriptures, and I believe that. I believe in keeping the commandments. I believe in reading in the Scriptures. I believe in looking for counsel, for following the counsel of our prophets and our leaders and our ecclesiastical people. We don't have to think about just the prophet. We can think about our stake president, our bishop, our elders quorum president, our home teachers. Each of these people can receive revelation that can help and sponsor us and help us and support us. I believe in these things. I believe that Heavenly Father wants us to be happy. Now, we need to experience trials and fear and concern and some troubles in life. But He will help us work through all of these. He'll help us reach the goals and the things that we need to do. Learning to trust the Lord is one of the most important things you'll do in this life. Learning to trust the Holy Ghost that it actually spoke to you. I want to just share something. My children know that I love to give them blessings for school and for difficult times in their life. And the Lord has been very kind to give us much revelation during those blessings. There's been much healing in people's lives, cancer that's been stopped, and a number of things that have happened through these wonderful blessings, where the priesthood has done miraculous things. But to make that happen, you have to trust the Lord. And I couldn't do those revelation and the things that they need to hear if I didn't have the confidence in the Lord to say the words that came through inspiration. And where did that confidence come from? It comes from taking risk and trying. So on my mission, we were asked to go by a lady to her father had been in a car accident, and we were asked to go give him a blessing. We went in there intending to give him a blessing that he'd be able to get better. As I put my hands on his head in this little hospital in Winchester, Virginia, I tried to bless him to get better, but the Spirit very clearly said, "It's time for you to go home, and I bless you to be released from this life and released from your body and the pain that's there, and to return to your Heavenly Father." And in a short time, he passed away. Now that was difficult. I didn't expect to do that during the blessing, but I trusted, and it was the right thing to do. It wasn't long after that we had a man that had asked to learn about the church. His wife had no interest. She would not even come into the room. And her mother lived there with him. And they would, when we came, after a very short time, they would leave the room, and he would have us teach him about the gospel. Well, this had been going on for about a month. And the mother of his wife died. And they said, "We don't have a church here in the area. Would you be willing to put on the funeral?" Well, our branch president was scared, petrified of funerals. And he said, "Would you missionaries do the funeral for us?" And so we said, "Well, yeah, we'll do that." And so we arranged the whole funeral, and we put the things together. And I was asked to give the eulogy and gospel talk associated with the funeral. And I got up there and I began to talk about the gospel and the resurrection and things. But then I had this impression that said, "Let me tell you about this lady." And I thought, well, that's interesting because I don't know anything about this lady. I said, "Let me tell you about her. When she was a mother with small children, she used to," and I began to tell stories. I told stories about this woman, about her humor, about how she treated her children, about how she cared for her neighbors, about how she lived her life. And I told all of these stories. Now, I've never talked to this lady other than to have her leave when I came in the room. But all of these stories came, and I just told them, I'm a silly 20-year-old missionary talking about things I have no data for. But the Spirit told me to do it. And so I did. I told all these stories. Afterwards, the wife of the investigator came up to me and said, I never thought anybody else understood my mother. I never thought anybody knew who she was like I did. But you described her perfectly. And I said, well, Heavenly Father knows your mother. And after that, they invited us over for dinner. And we had a lesson, and she asked if she could sit in. And she sat in. And then she sat in on all the rest of the lessons, and then she and her husband were baptized and later sealed in the temple. Now that only worked because I was willing to trust Heavenly Father. I can't tell you how many other times that I have given blessings and inspiration has come. And I think the only reason it keeps coming is because I don't fear to share what I feel. I've put my hands on a person who was going in for cancer surgery, and they asked for a blessing prior to going in to have this large tumor removed. And as I laid my hands on their head and began to bless them, the Spirit said, tell him that his body is being healed right now, and that the tumor is being removed right now, and that the cancer is gone from his body. That was a really scary thing to say to somebody. And when I finished that blessing, he looked at me like I was, I don't know if he thought I was crazy, or he went the next day to have the surgery. And the doctor says, I don't know what's wrong. That tumor was as big as a grapefruit. And they said, we can't find it. It's gone. And we have a picture. We have the MRI. And we got the new MRI, and it's not there. We don't know where it went. We don't understand. Well, he understood. The Lord, Heavenly Father understood. Most of these experiences are too sacred to talk about. I've given only a couple to explain that Heavenly Father will trust us with His power and with His priesthood and with revelation if we will trust Him to believe the revelation that we receive. As you live your life, look at 2 Nephi chapter 31, verses 19 through 21, where it asks you to follow Christ, to be baptized, to feast upon the words of Christ. Now, most people think that's the scriptures, and yes, they certainly are. But in 2 Nephi 32, verse 3, he says, as I told you to feast upon the words of Christ, angels speak the words of Christ. Therefore, follow the words that you are told. So basically, I didn't quote it, I only paraphrased it. Basically, what it tells them is that angels, when they speak, are speaking the words of Christ. And so the words of Christ are revelation that comes through the Holy Ghost. And the Holy Ghost will teach you all things that you should do. So read the scriptures, listen to the counsel of prophets, but seek the words of Christ that come through revelation of the Holy Ghost. And it will teach you all things that you should do. Trust. Learn to feel the Holy Ghost. Trust what He says. And you will always be led in the paths of happiness. I say that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.